My name is Daniel Whittaker. I am 36 years old, recently divorced, and for the last 5 months, I have been trying to restart my life in a way that feels meaningful. I am not the sort of person who ever pictured himself moving into an old, isolated house, let alone one that carried such an unsettling reputation in town. But desperation and opportunity often arrive as twins, and the house that came into my hands was one I never expected to inherit through circumstance or survive in with sanity intact. I purchased the property from my reclusive neighbor, a man named Henry Castor. He was 73 years old, wiry in frame, and always seemed as if the world itself was too loud for him. He lived 2 lots down from the modest rental I had taken after leaving my marriage, tucked away in a crooked house that seemed both forgotten by time and strangely preserved against it. The paint peeled but never fell. The shutters clung on those storms battered them, and the roofline leaned at angles that seemed wrong to the human eye. Yet despite all that, the house stood, stubborn and unyielding. Henry was known in town as a recluse. He had groceries delivered, never drove into town, and when children biked past his lane, they whispered stories about him being a witch, a murderer, or something worse. Adults, of course, dismissed these tales, though they quietly warned each other not to get too close. "Castor doesn't like visitors," they would say, lowering their voices. "Best to leave him be." I would not have spoken to him at all, except one evening when I came home from work later than usual. I saw him standing at the end of my driveway. He looked thinner than ever, his shoulders trembling beneath a heavy wool coat, though the evening air was mild. His pale eyes fixed on me in a way that was both pleading and commanding. When I greeted him, he raised a hand and said in a voice dry as leaves, "You're Daniel Whittaker." "Yes," I said, startled that he knew my name. "You live alone?" It was not a question. "Yes," I admitted, a little unsettled. He gave a small, jerky nod. "Good, then you're the one. I want to sell my house. To you." That was the beginning. The next few weeks unfolded strangely, as if I had been swept into someone else's dream. I learned that Henry had no surviving family, no friends, no ties of any kind that anyone in town could name. He handled everything himself, and, despite the rumors, had never broken a law. His decision to sell me the house came without negotiation. The price he asked was absurdly low, almost insulting for a property of its size. But when I questioned him, he simply said, "I need someone who will keep it. Not tear it down, not sell it on. You will keep it." I signed the papers less than a month later. The night before the closing, Henry came to see me again. This time he held a folded sheet of yellowing paper, creased so many times the edges had nearly torn away. He handed it to me with stiff, shaking fingers. "These are the things you must know," he whispered. His breath smelled faintly of iron and mold. "I don't care if you believe me. Just don't ignore them." The paper contained a list written in tight, slanted handwriting that was hard to read under the porch light. The words chilled me even before I understood them fully. 1. Do not stay in the cellar past midnight. 2. If you hear the upstairs door open after dark, lock your bedroom and wait until morning. 3. The 3rd floor window must never be uncovered. 4. If you dream of the well, do not drink water the next day. 5. On the last night of winter, leave the attic light on until dawn. I looked up at him unnerved. Is this some kind of joke? Henry's face did not change. His eyes were wide, pupils too large, and his voice was like wind scraping through dead grass. "Do as it says, or the house will take you too." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away. His gait stiff and unsteady, his figure swallowed by the shadow of his own crooked roof. When the deal closed, Henry vanished. He did not stay to collect his things, or to ensure the money had cleared. His belongings were still inside the house, every piece of furniture coated in dust, every shelf lined with brittle books and cracked photographs of people I did not recognize. There were no forwarding addresses, no instructions, no explanation. I asked around town, but no one knew where he had gone. Maybe he went off to die somewhere, the clerk at the diner muttered. He always looked half a ghost anyway. I should have walked away then. Should have ignored the too cheap deal, the list of strange rules, the air of something rotten that clung to the place. But I was desperate. My marriage had ended in flames of bitterness. My savings were gutted, and the idea of owning a house, any house, felt like reclaiming a piece of stability. So I moved in. The first days were quiet enough. The house creaked constantly, but old wood tends to complain. The walls seemed to breathe with drafts, and the smell of damp earth lingered in every corner. But that too could be explained. I spent my time sorting through Henry's belongings, deciding what to keep, what to burn, what to simply drag to the edge of the property and leave for the junkman. It was during one of these cleaning sprees that I ventured into the cellar. The door was heavy, its hinges groaning as if they had not moved in years. The stairs were narrow, descending steeply into cool darkness. I carried a flashlight, and its beam fell on stacked jars, broken furniture, and stone walls slick with moisture. The air was thick with mildew, but beneath it I thought I caught another scent, faintly metallic, like rust or blood. At the far end of the cellar was a low stone arch. Beyond it lay a smaller chamber, circular and deeper than the rest. The walls here were carved with shallow lines, not random scratches but deliberate patterns. Circles, spirals, intersecting shapes that seemed to writhe when the light touched them. In the center was a round, stone, capped opening, the kind you might see in a medieval well. The cap was sealed with iron bands, though one had rusted through. I remembered the fourth rule on Henry's list. If you dream of the well, do not drink water the next day. My skin prickled. I closed the flashlight beam quickly and retreated, heart hammering. That night I locked my bedroom door. I told myself it was silly, that I was letting an old man's madness poison my thoughts. But around 2 a.m, I woke to the sound of footsteps above me. Slow, dragging, deliberate. My breath caught in my chest. There was no one else in the house. I had not given anyone a key. Yet I heard the door to the upstairs hallway groan open, and then the steps came closer, stopping directly outside my bedroom. I clutched the blanket like a child, praying the lock would hold. The knob rattled once, twice, and stilled. After a long silence, the footsteps retreated. When dawn finally arrived, I opened the door to find the hall empty, the floorboards undisturbed, the air thick with a fatal, cold odor like extinguished candles. By the third day, I had begun to dread nightfall. I told myself I was tired, that stress and imagination made me hear things. But the house seemed alive with sounds no logic could explain. Whispers threaded through the vents, indistinct but urgent. A tapping came from behind the walls, in patterns too precise for rodents. And once, as I passed the covered third-floor window, I thought I saw the fabric ripple, as if something inside pressed against it, waiting. I considered moving out, even selling the house immediately, but the thought of returning to the cramped rental I had left behind, of admitting I had wasted my last savings, was unbearable. Pride chained me as tightly as fear, and part of me, though I hate to admit it, was curious. The rational part of my mind sought explanations. I told myself the list was superstition, the footsteps illusions, the whispers drafts. If I could catalog the strange events, explain them, I could conquer them. But explanations failed me on the 5th night. I woke again in the small hours, sweating and gasping from a dream I could not shake. I had been standing in the cellar, staring down into the sealed well. The iron bands were gone, the cap removed, and a black, glistening surface stared back. I leaned forward, and in the water I saw my own face. But it was not my reflection. Its lips moved on their own, forming words I could not hear, and its eyes were swollen, waterlogged, staring at me with a plea that curdled into malice. Then the hands rose from below, pale and clawing, reaching for my throat. I jolted awake, throat dry as sand, the taste of mildew in my mouth. I stumbled to the bathroom sink, turned the faucet, and let cold water gush into my cupped palms. But as I lifted it toward my lips, Henry's words echoed in my memory. "If you dream of the well, do not drink water the next day." I froze. The water trembled in my hands, then spilled uselessly back into the basin. My thirst burned, but fear burned hotter. I left the sink running until the pipes groaned, as though to drown out the dream. When I finally shut it off, the silence that followed was worse. It was then I realized something else. The list was not a warning from a madman. It was a set of instructions, a survival guide, and I had only begun to test its edges. The morning after that dream left me unsteady. I walked through the house like a trespasser in my own home, every floorboard groan sounding like a rebuke. The list sat on my nightstand, the yellow paper even more brittle after a week in my possession. I unfolded it again, staring at the ink strokes that had etched themselves into my nerves. Do not stay in the cellar past midnight. Lock the bedroom if the upstairs door opens. The third floor window must never be uncovered. The words carried more weight now. I believed them. Or at least, I was terrified of testing them. Still, a strange thought grew in me. If Henry had written such rules, then he had lived here long enough to know them by heart, which meant he had endured these same horrors, night after night for decades. How had he lasted as long as he did? And why choose me, of all people, to inherit this burden? I did not go to work that day. I called in sick, something my employer had grown used to since the collapse of my marriage and the subsequent unraveling of my discipline. Instead, I prowled the house, determined to understand it more deeply. I started in the attic. The attic was surprisingly clean compared to the cellar, though dust coated everything in a faint gray film. Boxes stood stacked neatly against the slanted walls, their labels faded but legible. Winter clothes, Christmas ornaments, tax papers. At first glance, the place could have belonged to any elderly man too tired to climb stairs. But on the far wall, directly beneath the roof peak, a single light bulb hung from a cord. It was switched off, but I remembered the rule on the last night of winter: leave the attic light on until dawn. Why only then? What happened on that particular night? I reached up, gave the bulb a twist, and it flickered weakly to life. Its glow was dull and yellow, but it illuminated something odd: a series of scratches on the floorboards below. They weren't the haphazard claw marks of rodents. They were symmetrical, forming a wide ring around the bulb's shadow, almost as though something had circled the light repeatedly, unable to cross into its glow. I shivered and switched the bulb off. Descending from the attic, I wandered into Henry's study on the second floor. This room seemed different from the others. The shelves were lined not just with novels or histories, but journals, leather-bound volumes, each labeled with years 1989, 1991, 1994. Nearly every year had a book. They filled 2 shelves entirely. My pulse quickened as I pulled one free, the leather stiff but intact. Inside were Henry's entries, written in the same slanted hand as the list. The early pages chronicled mundane things: the weather, the garden, his health. But soon the entries darkened. March 12, 1992, heard the upstairs door again. Stayed locked in my room. The scratching at the door lasted until dawn. April 3, 1992, dreamed of the well. Could not drink all day. Terrible thirst, but I kept the rule. November 29, 1992, the window fabric stirred though no wind blew. Did not look, will not look. The further I read, the less Henry seemed like a mad recluse, and more like a prisoner keeping records of his captor. My hands trembled as I flipped through the years, each entry repeating the same horrors I had begun to experience. Footsteps, whispers, dreams, warnings, rules. One entry stood apart. Dated February 28, 2001. Last night of winter tomorrow. Must remember light in attic. Always worse when I forget. Heard them in the walls for hours. Never again. I closed the book shaken and placed it back on the shelf. The room suddenly felt too crowded, as though the air itself pressed against me. I left, my nerves buzzing, and retreated downstairs. That evening I tried to distract myself with television, but every sound from the house drew my attention. By midnight, exhaustion pulled me to bed, but I left the list on the nightstand once more, as if its presence alone might shield me. I slept uneasily, every creak dragging me to the edge of waking. At some point in the dark hours, the sound came again, the groan of the upstairs door, the slow, deliberate steps. My body stiffened, every muscle taut with dread. I listened as the steps reached my door. The knob rattled. This time, instead of waiting, I pressed my ear against the wood. From the other side came a faint whisper. My name, not screamed or growled, but breathed, intimate and pleading. Daniel. I fell back, heart hammering. The lock held. The whisper came again, then silence. I did not sleep again that night. The next morning I discovered something new. On the floor outside my bedroom, the dust was disturbed, forming a perfect oval around the doorframe. Not footprints, not claw marks, just a smooth indentation, as though something without weight had pressed itself there. I backed away quickly, bile rising in my throat. That day, I began to drink more heavily than I had in years. Whiskey dulled the edge of my terror, though it did not erase it. By evening, emboldened or reckless, I decided to investigate the cellar again. The iron-banded well still sat in the circular chamber, its cap damp with condensation. I crouched beside it, running my hand along the rusting bands. To my shock, I felt a vibration. Very faint but rhythmic, like something shifting below. I pressed my ear to the stone. From the depths came a sound that could not be anything natural, a faint, wet whisper, almost like words rising through water. I stumbled back, heart pounding, and fled upstairs, bolting the cellar door behind me. That night, I did not sleep at all. I sat in the study, poring through Henry's journals one after another, desperate for answers. One passage struck me cold. September 6, 2005. They came closer last night, whispered my name. Sounded like my wife's voice, but she has been dead 20 years. Cannot trust them. Must never open the door. It was exactly what I had heard. My own name, spoken in a voice that was almost familiar. The thought chilled me more than anything else. These things, whatever they were, did not only know Henry, they knew me. The next few days blurred together. I avoided the cellar, avoided the third-floor window, and stared at the attic bulb as though it were a lifeline. I began marking time on a calendar, counting the days until the last night of winter, still weeks away. But each day brought new manifestations. The whispers grew louder, threading through the vents in the afternoon. Sometimes they seemed to laugh. Objects shifted places when I left a room. Once I returned to the kitchen to find every drawer pulled open, every utensil lined neatly on the counter. Then came the worst. On the 9th night in the house, I woke to silence so complete it roared in my ears. I sat up, sweating, sensing movement in the hallway. I reached for the lamp, but it would not turn on. The bulb was fine, the switch clicked, but no light came. Then, from the darkness of the hall, the knob turned slowly. This time, the lock clicked open. My throat closed in terror. I scrambled back across the bed, but before I could move further, the door eased inward. A draft like ice slid into the room, carrying with it the scent of wet stone. And then I saw it, a figure, half silhouetted in the dark. Tall, too tall, its head brushing the frame. Its arms hung at its sides, hands elongated, fingers too many. It did not step in, it only leaned forward, face obscured in shadow, and whispered again, "Daniel." I froze. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body betrayed me. The figure waited, the air thickened, and then, without sound, the door slammed shut. The lock clicked again, sealing me in. I did not sleep for the rest of the night. When dawn finally came, I stumbled downstairs, determined to flee the house forever. But when I opened the front door, I faltered. The yard outside looked the same, the morning sunlight spilling across the trees. Yet something about it was wrong. The colors too vivid, the air too still. It felt like a painted backdrop rather than the real world. My stomach turned, and I shut the door quickly, retreating inside. That was when I understood the true nature of the trap. The house did not want me to leave. The following days only deepened that impression. Each attempt to step outside left me dizzy, disoriented, sometimes even waking hours later back in the bed I had tried to escape. I tested it twice more, with the same results. Whether by hallucination or manipulation, the house kept me inside. And the list, Henry's cursed list, remained my only guidance. On the 12th day, desperate for answers, I forced myself back into the cellar. This time, I brought one of Henry's journals, hoping for courage. I lit a lantern and set it on the damp stone floor, illuminating the strange carvings circling the well. In the journal, dated July 1998, Henry had written, "The marks are older than the house. Whoever built here knew. They are meant to bind it, but the binding weakens every year. Must never let the cap be removed." I stared at the well cap, at the rust eating away the iron bands. Weakening. Just as Henry had written, a sound rose from below, soft at first, then louder. A voice, not Henry's, not mine, but someone I recognized all the same, my ex-wife, Sarah. Distinct pleading. "Daniel, help me." I dropped the lantern in shock, its glass shattering, the flame sputtering out. Darkness swallowed the chamber. I scrambled blindly back up the stairs, slamming the cellar door behind me. That night, the dreams came harder. The well again, water rising, hands breaking the surface. Sarah's voice, begging me to listen, to look, to open. When I woke, my throat was so dry I could hardly swallow. Yet I did not dare drink. The house had learned my weakness. Sleep became a rare and fragile thing. Every time I closed my eyes, I was dragged back into the same images: the cellar, the well, the rising hands, and voices that knew me too well. Sometimes Sarah, sometimes my father, sometimes people whose voices I could not place yet somehow recognized with a bone, deep familiarity. They pleaded, mocked, cajoled. When I woke, the thirst was unbearable, but I forced myself to resist. Henry's warning had become scripture. On the 15th night in the house, something changed. The voices did not wait for sleep. I was sitting in the study, journal open on my lap, when I heard a whisper directly in my ear. I spun around, but the room was empty. The whisper came again, this time from the opposite corner, then from the ceiling, then from beneath the floor. Each whisper was different, yet all carried the same intent: open, open, open. I pressed my palms over my ears until they ached, rocking in the chair like a madman. When I removed them, the house was silent once more. But the silence was worse, a waiting silence, heavy and expectant. I went back to Henry's journals, desperate for guidance. I flipped through years at random until one entry struck me. March 3rd, 2010. They will try to trick you. They will sound like your family, your friends. Do not believe them. The house has their voices, not their souls. If you answer, you give them strength. My stomach clenched. I realized then that I had already answered, though only in dreams. My whispered replies, "Sarah, Dad," might have been enough. A terrible fear lodged itself in my gut. The days blurred after that. I stopped working entirely, stopped calling anyone. My phone lay dead on the kitchen counter, battery drained, and I did not bother charging it. I had no desire to speak with the outside world. Not because I thought they would not believe me, but because some part of me feared the voices would slip through the line and infect whoever I reached. Isolation became my only shield, though it felt less like protection and more like a slow burial. Around the 20th night, I tested the third floor window. For weeks I had avoided it, keeping the heavy cloth draped across it as Henry had commanded. But curiosity, sharp and dangerous, ate at me. I climbed the stairs, each step creaking louder than the last, and stood before the covered frame. The cloth was heavy canvas, nailed at the corners. The edges fluttered slightly, though no wind stirred. I raised a hand, meaning only to brush the fabric, but as my fingers neared, the canvas bulged outward. Something pressed from the other side. Not a hand, not a face, but a shape that shifted like smoke under pressure. I stumbled back, heart racing, and the canvas rippled violently as though struck by unseen fists. A sound seeped through, a hiss, deep and guttural, filled with rage. I fled down the stairs 2 at a time, not daring to look back until I reached the ground floor. From below, I heard the pounding continue, rhythmic and insistent, like a beast demanding release. It lasted long into the night before fading into silence. The next morning, I found the nails at the corners of the canvas bent outward, the wood splintered. The thing behind the window had tried to claw its way inside. I hammered the cloth back tighter, hands shaking so badly I struck my fingers more than once. After that, I began to understand why Henry had survived so long. He had not fought the house, not really. He had endured it, obeyed its boundaries, lived by the rules as though they were sacred commandments. He had surrendered everything else. Family, community, even his sanity, to remain alive within its jaws. And when the years had stripped him bare, he had chosen me. Why me? The question gnawed at me daily. I thought back to the first time he spoke to me, how he had appeared at the end of my driveway without hesitation, declaring me the one. What did he see in me? Loneliness, desperation, some flaw that made me easier prey, or worse, some trait that made me suitable for what came next. The house did not wait for me to find the answer. On the 23rd night, I woke to the sound of water. It was a steady drip, 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 echoing through the air. I sat up confused and saw that the ceiling above my bed was soaked, water seeping through as though from a burst pipe. But the roof of the house was old, dry, brittle. There were no pipes above this room. The water fell faster, pooling on the floor, carrying with it a smell of rot and stagnant earth. I stumbled from the bed, splashing through the growing puddle, and realized the water was not falling randomly. It traced words across the plaster as it seeped down, letters forming one by one in wet, dark streaks. Well, I fled the room, slipping on the soaked boards, heart thundering. Behind me, the sound of dripping grew louder until it was a roar, as though an unseen river had burst through the ceiling. I locked myself in the study and sat trembling against the door until dawn. When I returned at sunrise, the room was dry. No puddles, no stains, no words. Only a faint damp smell lingering in the air. That day hunger gnawed at me. I had stopped eating properly days ago, surviving on stale crackers and sips of whiskey. But now my stomach ached, demanding more. I went to the kitchen, opened the fridge, and froze. Every item inside, Brelk, leftovers, was soaked in black water. The packages floated in it, bobbing gently as though in some unseen current. My throat seized at the sight. I slammed the door shut and backed away, hands trembling. The hunger did not ease, but the thought of touching any of it filled me with revulsion. I forced myself to go without, waiting for the feeling to dull into a hollow ache. By the 30th day in the house, I was nearly broken. My eyes burned from lack of sleep, my body weak from hunger and thirst, and yet the rules kept me alive. I had not stayed in the cellar past midnight. I had not uncovered the window. I had resisted the whispers, the water, the temptations. I had endured, but the last night of winter approached. Henry's words echoed in my mind. On the last night of winter, leave the attic light on until dawn. Always worse when I forget. I circled the date on the calendar, watching the days fall away until only one remained. Fear coiled in my stomach, sharper than ever. Whatever happened that night was the reason Henry had lasted, the reason he had written the rule. And now it was my turn. When the day arrived, I spent it pacing the house like a condemned man awaiting execution. Every window seemed darker, every shadow longer. I climbed to the attic before sunset, checking the bulb again and again, twisting it, tapping it, making sure it worked. The scratches on the floorboards seemed deeper than before, their circular pattern clearer in the dying light. At midnight, I sat cross-legged in the center of the ring, the bulb glowing weakly above me. The house groaned and shuddered around me, as though settling its weight for the night. At first, nothing happened. I began to wonder if it had all been paranoia, if the bulb's glow was merely symbolic. Then the scratching began. It came from the walls, from the roof, from beneath the floorboards. 1,000 claws raking at once, circling me in every direction. The bulb flickered, its light pulsing with each scrape. My breath came in shallow gasps. I clutched Henry's journal to my chest like a holy book, whispering nonsense prayers to no one. The scratches grew louder, faster, until they blended into a shriek. The floor trembled beneath me, the wood warping as though something beneath strained to burst through. The bulb flickered again, nearly dying, then blazed brighter than before. In its glow, I saw shapes pressed against the walls of the attic. Pale hands, twisted faces, bodies pressed flat as though the wood were only a thin veil. Their mouths opened in silent screams, their eyes glowing with hunger. They circled the ring, slamming against it, unable to cross into the light. The bulb's glow held them back, but I knew instinctively that if it failed, they would devour me. For hours they battered the barrier. The bulb flickered again and again, each time dimmer, until I was certain it would shatter. But at last, a gray dawn light seeped through the cracks in the roof, and the bulb's glow steadied. The figures faded, retreating into the walls like smoke dispersing. The scratching stopped. I collapsed, trembling, tears streaking my face. I had survived the last night of winter, but something in me had changed. When I descended the attic stairs, the house felt different. Quieter, almost welcoming. The air was lighter, the shadows less oppressive. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps I had passed some test, proven myself worthy to endure. Perhaps now the house would relent. I ate the last of the stale crackers, drank carefully from a bottle of whiskey, and allowed myself a few hours of dreamless sleep. But when I woke, the list was gone. I tore through the bedroom, then the study, then the entire house, searching every corner. The yellowed paper that had been my lifeline, my gospel, was nowhere to be found. In its place, lying neatly on my nightstand, was a new sheet of paper. The handwriting was the same, slanted and tight, but the words were different. 1. The well is opening. You must be ready. 2. When you hear the voice from the window, answer it. 3. The cellar is no longer safe. 4. Keep the attic dark. 5. You will know the rest when it is time. My blood ran cold as I read the lines. The rules had changed. The new list lay on my nightstand like a sentence written in advance. My hands shook as I read the words again, each one heavier than the last. The rules had changed. That alone was enough to unravel the fragile thread of control I had managed to keep. For weeks, the old list had been my only anchor, a set of commandments that kept me alive through horror. Now the anchor was gone, and I was adrift. The first line struck me hardest. The well is opening. You must be ready. I thought of the cellar, the rusting bands, the faint vibration I had felt through the cap. Ready for what? What could readiness mean when the very foundation of the house groaned with secrets too deep to fathom? The second line filled me with equal dread. When you hear the voice from the window, answer it. For weeks, I had obeyed Henry's warnings, never uncovering the third-floor window, never acknowledging the sounds that seeped through the canvas. Now, this new directive demanded I do the opposite. The thought made bile rise in my throat. The rest was no better. The cellar, my place of discovery, was now forbidden. The attic light, once my shield, must now remain dark. And the final rule, you will know the rest when it is time, was not a rule at all, but a sentence carved in ambiguity. I wanted to crumple the paper, burn it, reject it. But the memory of the first list stopped me. Henry had not been wrong. His rules had saved me more than once. If this new set of commands came from the same source, then I had no choice but to obey. For 2 days, nothing happened. The house seemed calmer, as though it had retreated to gather strength. I prowled through the rooms in silence, waiting for the inevitable. Hunger gnawed at me, thirst blistered my throat, but I resisted. The food in the fridge remained fouled with black water, and every time I turned the tap, the faint smell of rot rose from the sink. I ate dry oats from an old container, forcing them down raw, and sipped from the bottles of whiskey until each swallow burned more than it soothed. On the third night, the window called. It began with a faint tapping, like fingernails on glass. I froze in the hallway, staring up the staircase. The sound came again, rhythmic, deliberate. My hands shook as I climbed, every step dragging like lead. When I reached the third floor, the canvas over the window pulsed gently, as though something pressed against it from outside. Then a voice seeped through. Not Sarah this time, not my father. This voice was my own. Daniel, it whispered, let me in, please, I can help you. My blood turned to ice. It was not merely mimicking people I loved. It was mimicking me. The words, the tone, even the cadence of breath. I staggered back, nearly tumbling down the stairs. But the new rule echoed in my head. When you hear the voice from the window, answer it. I licked my dry lips, trembling. What do you want? I whispered. The canvas shuddered. My voice answered, faint but clear. I want to show you the truth. Open the cloth. Just a corner. Enough to see. Every instinct screamed no. Yet the rule pressed on me, heavy as gravity. With shaking hands, I reached up and pried one nail loose from the corner of the canvas. The fabric fell back just an inch, exposing a sliver of glass. What I saw nearly drove me mad. It was night outside, yet not the night I knew. The world beyond the glass was black, the trees twisted into skeletal forms, the sky veined with red like cracked flesh. And there, pressed against the glass, was my own face. But not my reflection. It was me, grinning too wide, eyes swollen black, teeth long and sharp. The other, me pressed a hand to the glass, fingers boneless and writhing. Its mouth opened, and the voice, my voice, spilled out. We are waiting. The well is opening. You are chosen. I ripped the canvas back into place, driving the nail through with such force the wood splintered. The voice cut off immediately, replaced by a hiss that vibrated through the walls. I fled down the stairs, gasping, heart hammering. That night, I did not sleep. The whispers filled the house, circling, pressing, repeating the same phrase in dozens of voices. The well is opening. The well is opening. Over and over until my skull felt ready to crack. By morning, I could no longer deny it. The new rules were not guidance for survival. They were preparation for something worse, something final. I avoided the cellar, though I felt its pull with every passing hour. The floorboards above it seemed to vibrate faintly now like a drum beat. Sometimes I caught a faint draft rising from the gaps, damp and cold, smelling of earth and old stone. Once, I even thought I heard water dripping below, though the cap should have sealed it. The well was indeed opening. The attic became a place of terror. The light bulb, once my shield, now mocked me with its uselessness. I could not bring myself to turn it off, though the new list commanded it. Every night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, imagining what waited in the dark above me. Eventually, my cowardice won. I left the light on, clinging to its protection. If the new rules demanded I extinguish my only weapon, then perhaps I was doomed regardless. On the 35th day, something new happened. As I wandered the hallway, I heard a soft thud behind me. I turned and froze. There, on the floor where nothing had been before, lay another sheet of paper. I picked it up with shaking hands. The writing was the same, but the words were fewer. You are almost ready. The door will open soon. No list of rules this time. No guidance. Just a promise, or a threat. That night the house began to shift. I do not know how else to describe it. The walls groaned, the floor tilted, the air thickened. It felt less like a house and more like a body, stretching, flexing, preparing. I clutched the journal I had been reading. Henry's words a small comfort, and whispered to myself over and over, survive, survive, survive. The window called again, but I did not answer. The whispers rose from the cellar, but I did not go. I broke every new rule, clinging desperately to the old ones. But the house seemed to know. It seemed to punish me. Around midnight, the lights in the entire house flickered out. Darkness swallowed everything. I stumbled through the rooms, searching for matches, candles, anything. My hand brushed against the wall, and to my horror, the wall pressed back. It bulged beneath my palm like skin stretched over muscle. I jerked back, gagging, and heard the faintest sound. Breathing. The house was breathing. I fled to my bedroom, barricaded the door with a chair, and sat trembling in the dark. The whispers rose again, but this time they were joined by footsteps, dozens of them, circling the room. I pressed my hands to my ears, but still I heard them, inside my skull. Chosen, they whispered, chosen. By dawn the noises faded, leaving me hollow. I slept in brief, restless snatches, waking each time to the sound of distant water. Always water. On the 36th day, I found the cellar door ajar. I had locked it days before, but the lock now hung broken, twisted as though by enormous force. A faint damp smell rose from below, stronger than ever. I stood staring for hours, paralyzed. At last, I forced myself to shut the door again, nailing it closed with trembling hands. But as I hammered, the wood vibrated beneath my blows, pulsing like a heartbeat. I knew then that my efforts were pointless. The house wanted the well open. It was only a matter of time. That evening, I returned to the study and pulled down one of the last journals I had not yet read. The entry on the final page stopped my breath. March 15, 2017. The house is not a house. It is a mouth. The well is its throat. I have kept it sealed as long as I could, but my strength is gone. When I die, it will need another. That is why I chose Daniel. He will last longer than me. I dropped the book, bile rising in my throat. The words confirmed what I had feared. Henry had not chosen me by chance. He had chosen me as a replacement. I was not a victim of bad luck, not a random inheritor. I was selected, groomed, delivered into the jaws of something older than stone. That night, the window voice returned one last time. My voice, clear and commanding. Daniel, it said, it is time. Open the well. I wept, rocking back and forth on the floor, clutching the journal. The rules, the whispers, the horrors, they had not been to protect me. They had been to shape me, to break me down, to mold me into the next keeper. The house was not only alive, it was hungry, and I was its caretaker now. I did not sleep the night after I read Henry's final journal entry. His words carved themselves into my mind, repeating over and over like a chant. The house is not a house. It is a mouth. The well is its throat. He had chosen me, not for kindness or mercy, but as a sacrifice. The realization did not shatter me. It hollowed me. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, barely noticing the walls pulsing, the whispers sharpening, the air thickening. It was as if the house no longer bothered to hide its nature. It no longer needed to. The morning of the 37th day brought a silence that terrified me more than any whisper or shadow. No footsteps, no voices, no scratching. Even the birds outside were absent, the air so still I wondered if time itself had stopped. I wandered from room to room, waiting, but the quiet persisted, pressing down until my ears rang. It felt like the pause before an executioner's blade. By dusk, I found myself at the cellar door again. The nails I had driven into it were bent outward, twisted like soft clay. The door hung slightly open, a damp draft spilling out, carrying the smell of earth and stagnant water. I knew then that resistance was over. The well was opening whether I wanted it or not. I descended with a lantern clutched in one hand, though the flame did little against the dark. Each step groaned under my weight, as though warning me to turn back. At the bottom, the chamber glistened with moisture. The carvings on the walls slick with condensation. The iron bands around the well cap were nearly corroded through, rust flaking away in wet chunks. And from beneath, I heard it clearly now breathing. Deep, slow, tidal. The sound filled the chamber, vibrating through the stone, rattling in my chest like a second heartbeat. I stumbled back, pressing against the wall, but the carvings burned cold against my spine. The breathing grew louder, shifting into words, dozens of voices at once, overlapping and layered. Daniel, Daniel, Daniel. I clutched my ears, but the voices were inside me. They were not speaking to my body. They were speaking to the marrow of my bones. And then, with a groan like mountains splitting, one of the iron bands snapped. The well cap shifted, lifting slightly, water seeping through the crack. The black liquid glistened in the lantern light, and a stench rolled out that nearly made me retch. Hands rose from the gap. Pale, thin, clawed fingers grasped the stone, pulling. The cap slid further aside, another band breaking with a shriek of rust. Water sloshed, spilling over, but it was not water, not entirely. It wreathed, thick and dark, moving with a life of its own. Faces appeared in it, human and not, their mouths open in silent screams before dissolving again. I screamed, the first real scream since this nightmare began, and fled up the stairs. Behind me, the cellar thundered as if something massive shifted in its depths. I slammed the door shut, but it did not matter. The sound carried through the floorboards, the whole house vibrating with the rhythm of the thing's rise. The rest of the night blurred into madness. The walls warped, bulging inward, as though something enormous pressed from the other side. The floors pulsed wetly, and black water seeped up through the cracks, pooling in the rooms. Every mirror in the house cracked simultaneously, shards spilling across the floors, each fragment reflecting not my face, but dozens of others twisted, decayed, grinning. The voices no longer whispered. They screamed. They called my name in unison, demanding, commanding, exulting. Daniel, open. Daniel, chosen. Daniel, now. I fled to the attic, the only place that felt remotely safe. I clung to the light bulb cord, flicking it on, though the new rules had told me to keep it dark. The glow filled the space weakly, but enough to push back the shadows. The scratches on the floorboards were fresh now, gouged deep, circling me in tight spirals. As I sat trembling in the center, I realized the house had herded me here. This was not refuge. This was ritual. Hours passed. I lost track of time. The light flickered, steadied, flickered again. Below, the sound of rushing water grew louder, as if the well had erupted into a river. At some point, exhaustion claimed me, and I slipped into a fevered dream. I stood at the mouth of the well, But it was no longer in the cellar. It yawned in the center of the world, vast and endless, the earth around it crumbling into darkness. Shapes rose from its depths, countless figures writhing in black water, their faces familiar and strange. My ex-wife Sarah, my father, people I had known in childhood, even Henry, his pale eyes wide with terror. They reached for me, their mouths open, voices layered together in a single command jump. I awoke with a scream, sweat soaking my clothes, throat raw. The bulb above me flickered violently, buzzing like an insect caught in glass. And then it went out. The darkness that filled the attic was not ordinary. It was heavy, textured, alive. I heard movement all around me, claws scraping, bodies pressing, mouths opening. Dozens, hundreds. They circled, pressed against me, yet did not touch. They were waiting. The lantern flickered to life on its own, though I had not touched it. Its weak glow illuminated the paper lying on the floor before me. A new message, written in the same tight slanted hand. Now you understand. The mouth must feed. The air split with a roar and the house convulsed. The floor cracked, the walls bowed, the ceiling split. Black water gushed upward, flooding the attic, dragging me toward the center of the spiral of scratches. I fought, clawing at the boards, but the water carried me, cold and thick, filling my mouth, my lungs. I was pulled downward through the floor, through the house, into the cellar. The well cap was gone now, shattered stone floating like driftwood in the flood. The throat gaped wide, swallowing everything. Faces pressed against mine, hands grasping, pulling me deeper. I tried to scream, but only bubbles spilled out. In that moment, I saw it clearly. The house was only the surface, the mask. Beneath it lay the true thing, vast and incomprehensible, older than any stone foundation. A mouth that spanned beyond the earth, a hunger that no amount of flesh or soul could satisfy. And I, Daniel Whittaker, was not its victim. I was its servant. I remembered Henry's words. I have kept it sealed as long as I could. When I die, it will need another. That was the truth. The house did not kill its chosen. It kept them, twisted them, made them its keepers. Not to escape, but to endure. To pass on the burden, generation after generation. Each one feeding it just enough to keep it sated but not full. The black water closed over my head. My lungs burned, my body convulsed, and then, impossibly, I breathed. The liquid filled me, searing my chest, but it did not drown me. It became me. My vision blurred, then sharpened again, the darkness alive with shapes. They surrounded me. The keepers before me, their eyes hollow, their mouths whispering in unison. Welcome, Daniel. I do not know how long I drifted there, suspended in the well's throat, watching faces rise and dissolve in the current. Days, months, years, it no longer mattered. Time had no meaning. Hunger was all. And when I finally opened my mouth, I found I could speak with the others, my voice merging with theirs into the chorus. The house above waits now, quiet, patient. To any who pass, it looks abandoned, leaning. Just another relic of a forgotten man. But inside it breathes, it waits. And I wait with it. The list lies ready for the next one. My name is Jonathan Mercer, and the summer I turned 23, I accepted a position that, at the time, seemed like a perfect way to escape the noise of ordinary life. I had just graduated from college, unsure of what career path to follow, and needed both solitude and a paycheck. A seasonal job with the Forestry Service as a fire lookout felt like it had been designed for me personally. A simple post, a government check, and miles of wilderness in every direction. I imagined reading books in the quiet, sketching landscapes from the tower, maybe even writing something worth keeping. What I did not imagine was how isolation erodes perception, how silence amplifies the smallest sound until it seems like a voice, and how certain places hold histories that are better left undisturbed. I will tell you everything as plainly as I can, for these things happened to me. And though my mind has wrestled with doubt, I cannot deny the evidence of my senses. Training for the position was brief. They showed us a slideshow of fire behavior, instructed us on how to use the Osborne fire fender, a brass and wooden circular device bolted to the desk in the tower, used to measure bearings and distance to smoke, and reviewed the radio codes we would need. A handful of us were hired that summer, spread across different towers in the National Forest. I made small talk with the others, but the truth is I was already imagining myself alone, watching weather fronts roll over distant ridges, the air humming with possibility. Solitude felt romantic, a way to reset myself after years of crammed lecture halls and the endless chatter of peers. The tower assigned to me was called Garnet Peak Lookout. It was an aging, square frame structure raised on stilts above the treetops, accessible only by a narrow dirt road and a final half-mile hike. The service truck dropped me off with my duffel bag, a cooler, and a week's worth of supplies, promising a pack mule delivery for bulkier goods in a few days. The driver, a quiet man named Davis, gave me one last look before leaving. His eyes lingered as though he wanted to say something but swallowed the words. I told myself it was nothing. Inside, the tower was exactly what I had seen in photographs. A single room with windows on all four sides, a bed in one corner, a desk with the fire finder in the center, and shelves lined with notebooks, maps, and government forms. A small propane stove waited for me, as did a battered coffee pot. The walls were painted the greenish hue of bureaucracy, the kind of color that makes you feel both safe and trapped. I unpacked, swept dust from the floor, and settled in. For the first few days, everything matched my fantasy. The sunsets drenched the horizon in molten colors. The mornings were cool and crisp, dew steaming from the pine needles. At night, the stars were so sharp they felt like they could cut your skin. Yet even in those early days, before I admitted anything was wrong, I began noticing details that prickled the back of my neck. The logbooks left behind by previous lookouts were not filled with weather observations or fire reports. At least not exclusively. Some pages contained frantic scribbles, words pressed hard enough into the paper that they tore through. One entry read voices in the draw again. Not coyotes. Another said, if the mirror is turned, don't look. I told myself these were jokes, or perhaps the product of someone losing their mind to loneliness. Still, I felt uneasy enough that I closed the books and placed them back on the shelf, spine out, as though their contents could be contained by the mere act of tidiness. Communication with the ranger station was required twice daily, once at 9 in the morning, once at 6 in the evening. I would radio in, give the weather conditions, and confirm that no smoke was visible. The voice on the other end was usually Ranger Haskins, who sounded perpetually distracted. He never asked about me personally, only about the sky, the wind, and the ridgelines. That suited me fine. I preferred my solitude, or at least I thought I did. By the end of the first week, I had begun hearing something at night. It started subtly, like the rustling of branches far below the tower. I assumed it was deer moving through the underbrush, or perhaps black bears. But then the sounds changed. They became rhythmic, measured, almost like footsteps circling the base of the tower. Each night, the pattern repeated. A few hours after sunset, while I sat with a book or tried to sleep, the crunching would begin. Sometimes it sounded like pacing. Other times, like someone, or something, dragging a stick slowly along the support beams. I told myself it was the wind, but the rationalization never fit. The third night of this strange routine, I forced myself to look out the windows. The moon was bright enough to illuminate the clearing below. The trees swayed, shadows shifted, but I saw nothing human, nothing animal either. Still, the sound continued, as though the source was clever enough to remain always just out of view. My skin prickled. I wanted to radio the ranger station, but what would I say? That the night air was too noisy. I convinced myself to wait it out. The next morning, I descended the stairs to inspect the ground. Pine needles lay undisturbed, soil soft from recent rain, but no prints of any kind. No hoof marks, no paw prints, no boot impressions. I squatted, running my fingers through the dirt, hoping to find some trace. The silence mocked me. That day, when the pack mule delivery arrived, I asked the handler if wildlife ever circled the towers at night. He frowned, as though I had asked the wrong question. Best not to go looking for what you don't want to find, he muttered, tightening the straps on his pack. Before I could press him, he whistled to his mule and started back down the trail. The logbooks whispered in the back of my mind. If the mirror is turned, don't look. I had not seen any mirror in the tower, aside from a small shaving mirror in the bathroom nook. Yet the phrase lodged itself in my thoughts like a splinter. That night, I turned the mirror to face the wall before going to bed. I slept only fitfully, the footsteps circling once again, steady and patient. On the 10th day, I spotted smoke. A thin gray column rose beyond the eastern ridge. Adrenaline surged. Finally, I thought I could perform the job I had been hired for. I hurried to the fire finder, lined up the sighting apertures with the smoke, and called it in with the proper bearing. The ranger station thanked me, promised to send a crew, and instructed me to continue watching. I did. The smoke persisted for half an hour, then dissipated abruptly, like mist burned away by sunlight. I reported this too, but the radio crackled with only a curt acknowledgement. The following morning, Ranger Haskins asked why I had reported smoke when no fire crew had been able to locate the source. I insisted I had seen it clearly, that it was real. He sighed and told me to keep an eye out, but refrain from false alarms. His tone made my stomach twist. I began to wonder if the job was a test not of vigilance but of sanity. That night, the footsteps returned, louder, bolder. I sat rigid in the dark, every muscle tight, gripping the flashlight as if it were a weapon. The sound climbed the stairs, one creak, then another. I snapped on the light and shone it out the window, but the steps ceased instantly, leaving only silence so thick I could hear my own pulse. I did not sleep until dawn. The days blurred together after that. Hunger came and went, though I forced myself to eat canned beans and jerky. My eyes grew accustomed to scanning the horizon for fire, but more often I caught myself staring into the woods, searching for movement that never revealed itself. The logbooks beckoned, their spines crooked on the shelf. I resisted until one particularly bleak evening when I could no longer bear the loneliness. The entries grew stranger the further I read. One lookout had charted not smoke sightings but voices by direction. North voice, south voice, east voice, west voice. Another had drawn diagrams of the tower itself, with marks around the foundation as though mapping the path of something that circled endlessly. The most recent notebook ended mid-sentence. If it asks to be let in, do not. The page after was blank. Sleep abandoned me almost entirely. I began pacing the tower myself, tracing the narrow perimeter, eyes darting to the windows. My reflection in the glass startled me more than once. The gaunt face staring back seemed older, hollowed. The shaving mirror I had turned toward the wall. I caught myself checking it compulsively, just to confirm it had not been moved. Each time it remained exactly where I had left it, though I was never entirely reassured. One dawn, after a night of relentless circling noises, I decided to descend the tower armed with my flashlight and pocket knife. The ground was empty, pristine, yet carved into one of the support beams was a fresh mark, a crude spiral gouged deep into the wood. My breath caught. I knew with certainty it had not been there before. I touched it, half expecting the wood to be warm, but it was cold and rough. I reported nothing of this to the ranger station. What would I say? That a spiral had appeared overnight. That footsteps stalked me daily. My credibility had already been bruised by the vanished smoke. Instead, I carried the knowledge silently, my mind heavier with each passing day. The days stretched long, filled with paranoia. Sometimes I thought I saw movement in the distance. Not smoke, but figures slipping between trees, pale and quick. At night, the circling grew more insistent. Once, I woke to tapping on the glass itself. Soft, deliberate, like knuckles on a door. I froze in bed, afraid to breathe. The tapping repeated twice, then ceased. When daylight came, no mark remained on the windows. I began keeping my own logbook, separate from the official reports. In it I recorded every sound, every sighting, every unease. Writing was the only way to anchor myself. Yet I noticed, with a chill, that my handwriting sometimes shifted, cramped and slanted, unlike my usual style, as if another hand guided the pen. 2 weeks into the job, I dreamed of fire. In the dream, the forest burned with white flames that made no smoke, only shrieks that sounded like human voices. When I woke, the horizon glowed faintly, though the air was clear. I wondered if I had brought something back with me from the dream. By then, I no longer trusted the radio. Its static often carried whispers, faint and unintelligible, between transmissions. Once, I heard my own name hissed in the static, unmistakable, Jonathan. My stomach dropped, and I nearly hurled the radio out the window. Instead, I shut it off, sitting in silence, but the silence was worse. The isolation that had once seemed romantic now pressed on me like a physical weight. The tower creaked in the wind, every sound amplified. I found myself counting the seconds between gusts, as though the numbers could protect me. At times, I swore the tower swayed, though I knew it was anchored solidly to bedrock. I am not sure when the line between reality and imagination blurred, but I can tell you this: one night, I heard the footsteps stop at the very top of the stairs. The doorknob rattled. Not violently, not like an animal, like someone testing it gently, patiently. I sat frozen, my breath shallow. The knob turned a fraction, then stilled. After that, the silence was absolute. I did not open the door until morning. Nothing waited outside, nothing visible. But in the dirt at the base of the stairs, I finally found prints, not boots, not paws, not hooves. They were elongated, too narrow, like impressions left by hands pressed into the soil, fingers spread wide. They led away from the tower and vanished into the undergrowth. I stopped reporting anything but the weather after that. My official radio logs remained bland, factual. Clear skies, no smoke, wind steady from the northwest. But in my private notebook, the pages filled with darker truths, spirals drawn over and over, crude sketches of long hands reaching upward. I could not stop myself. The act of drawing felt compelled, inevitable. And so the summer that I had once imagined as a retreat into quiet became something else entirely. A slow unraveling, a test of whether the mind can survive when pressed by forces unseen yet undeniable. This is only the beginning, and the worst of it was still to come. Days and nights lost their edges after I found those prints in the dirt. The forest seemed to hold its breath whenever I stepped outside, as though every pine and fir leaned inward. Listening, I kept scanning the ground, hoping to find more tracks that might explain the phenomenon rationally, but the earth revealed nothing beyond that single set of elongated impressions. No scat, no fur, no claw marks. Only the faint outline of fingers pressed impossibly deep, vanishing into the woods like a signature written in a language I wasn't meant to understand. I tried to keep to routine. Each morning I made coffee on the propane stove, forcing myself to read the weather instruments and radio in my report. Clear skies, 20% humidity, no smoke visible. The words tasted like lies in my mouth. as if by saying them I erased the evidence of the night before. The ranger station never asked questions beyond the basics. Haskins' voice remained clipped, impatient, like he was always eager to end the call. That suited me. The less I had to speak, the better. But silence grew heavier with each passing day. I found myself talking aloud just to hear human tones, reading passages of books in a deliberate voice to break the stillness. Sometimes, in the middle of a sentence, I swore I heard another voice echo mine, soft and delayed, like the tower walls themselves were repeating me. Once I read the line, "All is well here in the wilderness," and I heard, carried on no wind, a perfect whisper, "All is well." My mouth went dry, and I slammed the book shut. Sleep became impossible. I tried keeping the lantern lit at night, hoping the glow would ward off whatever circled outside. But even with light flooding the tower, the sounds persisted. The steps crunched, the dragging scratched, the taps brushed against the glass. I taped the little shaving mirror face down to the shelf, afraid of seeing something over my shoulder that didn't belong. Yet even hidden, it pulled at my awareness, as though daring me to check if it had shifted. The worst moments came in the liminal hours, just before dawn, when the forest was darkest, and just before dusk, when the shadows grew long and doubled. One morning, eerie-eyed, I thought I saw a figure leaning against a pine in the clearing below. It was too far to discern detail, just a tall, pale shape. I raised my binoculars, but the glass fogged instantly, obscuring my view. When I wiped them clean, the figure was gone. Food supplies dwindled faster than expected. Perhaps it was stress eating, or perhaps I had miscalculated. Either way, I grew lean, my belt looser around my waist. I began stretching my meals, counting beans in the tin like coins. The Forest Service had promised another mule delivery, but none came. Days passed. Each evening when I radioed in, I considered demanding more food, but fear of sounding hysterical kept me restrained. I wanted them to believe I was reliable. I wanted them to believe I wasn't unraveling. On the 17th night, I woke to the distinct sound of the door handle turning. Not rattling this time, turning. The old brass knob squeaked in its housing, as though gripped firmly. My body locked in place. I stared at the outline of the door, lit faintly by moonlight through the windows. The handle rotated slowly, deliberately, halfway down. Then it held down, suspended. My breath came shallow, heart slamming against my ribs. After what felt like an hour, but was likely only seconds, the handle released, easing back to neutral. I lay awake until the sky brightened, eyes glued to the door. In the morning, I found scratches around the lock, shallow grooves like something had pressed repeatedly against the metal. Not claws, not a tool, something narrow, tapered, like fingernails. I no longer trusted the tower to keep me safe. I carried the hatchet, meant for chopping firewood, everywhere inside. My journal entries became frantic, page after page filled with half-finished sentences and spirals drawn unconsciously in the margins. Sometimes I would look down and find my hand already sketching the pattern, before I realized what I was doing. The spiral widened, turning inward, pulling the eye deeper until the center blurred. I tore out pages and burned them on the stove, but even the smoke curled into spirals as it rose, as if mocking me. Around this time, I began hearing music. Faint, lilting notes drifting through the trees, like someone playing a flute at a distance. The sound came mostly at dusk, carried on no wind, threading between the trunks. It was not a melody I recognized, a tonal, uneven, as though composed by someone who knew the mechanics of music, but not the soul of it. I tried covering my ears, but the tune seemed to seep into bone, bypassing the eardrum entirely. When it faded, the silence felt worse. The following day, desperate for contact, I broke protocol and radioed the station at noon. "This is Garnet Peak Lookout," Mercer reporting. I said, my voice trembling despite my effort to steady it. "Can you confirm the next supply run?" "I'm running short." Static hissed back, followed by Haskins' bored reply, "Copy Garnet. Delivery scheduled soon. No exact date. Stand by." I pressed him. "I need to know when. Supplies are low." There was a long pause. Then he said flatly, "You'll have enough." The transmission cut off. The phrasing unsettled me. Not, "We'll get you enough." Not, "Supplies will arrive." Simply, "You'll have enough." As though the forest itself had already accounted for my survival. That night, the music came closer. I stepped to the window, lantern dimmed, and saw movement below. Figures slipped between trees, pale against the dark trunks. They did not move like animals. Their limbs were too long, their gait too smooth, gliding rather than walking. Each carried something that glinted faintly, catching moonlight like polished bone. I gripped the hatchet until my knuckles ached, forcing myself to stay hidden in shadow. The figures did not approach the tower, but circled the clearing, the flute like notes swelling as they moved. After an hour, they melted back into the forest. The next morning, I found more spirals carved into the support beams. Perfectly symmetrical this time, not the crude gouges I had first seen. Each was about the size of my palm, etched deep into the wood. I counted 12 in total, evenly spaced, as though forming a boundary around the tower. My stomach twisted when I realized they matched the diagrams I had seen in the old logbooks. By the 20th day, I was half mad with exhaustion. I caught my reflection in the window glass and recoiled at the hollowed eyes, the cracked lips. My skin looked too pale, my hair matted. Worse, I thought I saw something else layered over my reflection, a faint outline of another face, featureless and smooth, like wax stretched over bone. When I blinked, it was gone. I began to dread nightfall with a child's terror. I stuffed rags against the cracks in the door, piled furniture against it, though I knew such measures would be useless if something truly wanted entry. Still, the ritual soothed me, gave me the illusion of control. Each night the footsteps circled. The flute wailed, the tapping persisted. Sometimes, beneath the music, I swore I heard my own name woven into the notes. Then came the whisper, clearer than anything before, unmistakable, as though someone stood directly beside my bed. "Jonathan, let me in." My heart lurched. I turned slowly, but the room was empty, shadows stretching harmlessly. The whisper came again, closer, directly in my ear. "Jonathan." I leapt up, hatchet raised, swinging wildly at the air. The blade clanged against the window frame, sending a jolt up my arm. Nothing stood there. Yet the whisper lingered in memory, as vivid as any human voice. The next day, I considered abandoning the post. Hiking out meant miles of wilderness, but at least it would be movement, escape. Yet something inside me recoiled from the thought. The forest seemed to lean closer, as though waiting for me to try. I remembered the mule handler's words, "Best not to go looking for what you don't want to find." My instincts screamed that the woods would not let me leave so easily. The tower, for all its horrors, might be the only place keeping me tethered. I forced myself to hold the radio during evening check, in ready to confess everything, to demand extraction. But when Haskins answered, his voice sounded wrong. Hollow, distorted, as though spoken through layers of water. "Report," he said. My throat tightened. "No smoke, skies clear," I replied mechanically. There was a pause, then the faintest echo. Clear skies, no smoke. But it wasn't Haskins repeating me. The voice was higher, distant, carrying the same unnatural cadence I'd heard in the flute music. I dropped the radio. That night, something climbed the stairs again, slow, deliberate. I crouched in the corner, hatchet raised, pulse hammering. The knob rattled, then stilled. A voice spoke, muffled through the door, calm and measured. "Jonathan, enough watching. Open the door." My mouth went dry. I wanted to scream that I would not, but fear locked my jaw. Silence followed. Minutes passed. Then, a sound like fingernails dragging down the wood, leaving trails too deep to be human. By morning, the outer door was scarred with grooves running its full length. I sat on the floor shaking, staring at the marks. I wanted desperately to believe this was madness, that isolation had fractured me, but my eyes and fingers confirmed otherwise. The wood had been carved. The tower was under siege. I began rationing coffee, saving it for the hours before dawn when my willpower waned most. The bitter taste anchored me, kept me awake. Still, exhaustion pressed like a weight. Once, I nodded off at the desk and woke to find my notebook open, a new spiral drawn across 2 pages in heavy strokes. The pen still lay in my hand. I had no memory of writing it. On the 22nd night I broke. The whisper returned, softer, coaxing. Just a glance. Just once. Against every instinct, I untaped the small mirror from the shelf. My reflection swam before me, gaunt and hollow. Then the glass shimmered. Behind my image, another figure appeared, taller, faceless. Its hand resting on my shoulder, though nothing touched me. I screamed, flinging the mirror across the room. It shattered against the wall, shards scattering. From outside, the flute music rose in triumph. The tower felt poisoned after that, its walls thinner, its safety compromised. I swept the mirror fragments into a tin and sealed it, afraid the shards might still hold that image. But every reflective surface betrayed me after. Window glass, even the sheen of coffee in my mug. Always, faintly, the faceless outline hovered near. Food nearly gone, sanity unraveling, I faced a choice: remain and risk whatever waited to breach the tower, or descend into the forest where figures glided and music played. Neither path promised survival. Yet as I sit here writing this, I sense the decision may already be made for me. For the whispers are louder now, the spirals etched deeper, and something tells me the tower was never meant to protect at all. It was meant to contain. Morning began as a film laid over a nightmare, thin, grainy, colorless. The tower smelled faintly of cold metal and stale coffee, and the ghost of propane. I swept the floor as if tidying could evict whatever I'd invited by peeling the tape from that little mirror. The shards sat sealed in the tin, a dull rattle whenever moved it, like teeth in a box. I set the tin on the shelf beside the logbooks and placed a map over it, as though paper could smother reflection. When my hand left the lid, I felt the tiniest drag, like the tin wanted to stay attached to my palm, like it had weight out of proportion to its size. I ignored that feeling because there were only 2 options now. Either I had let something in, or I had simply let it closer, and pretending those were different felt necessary to get through the hour. I told myself I would do something practical, scientific, whatever that still meant. So I made a plan. The plan had steps. Step 1, go outside in daylight. Step 2, walk a measured bearing due east to the saddle between Garnet Peak and the next ridge, the same direction I had once seen smoke. Step 3, leave bright strips of orange flagging tape at intervals so I could find my way back. Step 4, stay out no longer than 90 minutes before returning, no matter what. That last rule, I repeated aloud. No matter what. I said it in the same tone I used to recite phone numbers, as if memorizing could make it true. I strapped the hatchet to my belt, stuffed water and jerky in my pack, and took the good compass from the desk. The circle of spirals carved around the tower looked different in full sun. Neater, more deliberate, each groove catching light like inlaid metal. I knelt to trace one and felt the oddest sensation, as if my fingertip dipped into a current running the wrong way, pulling in rather than flowing out. It made my nail ache. I withdrew, stood, and forced myself down the stairs. The forest accepted me without ceremony. The fragrance of hot pine resin and dust rose as I walked. The ground was springy where needles layered thick, and I was briefly, absurdly grateful to feel the ordinary discomfort of a twig pricking through my boot. I set the compass to 90 degrees and went. Every 10 yards I tied a strip of flagging tape to a branch eye. Level, making sure the ribbon fluttered free, bright as a wound. The first 100 yards, I heard only insects and one distant woodpecker. I could almost believe that the nightlife of the tower did not exist beyond the clearing, that the world kept ordinary hours. 200 yards in, the air changed. It cooled without shade, like stepping under a cloud not visible in the sky. The insects went quiet, as if someone had drawn a curtain over a stage. My boot met a patch of soil that yielded too easily, like packed flour. When I looked down, I saw a dim oval pressed into the earth. The suggestion of fingers splayed wide, already softening at the edges as if the ground tried to forget it. I stepped around it, careful not to disturb the print, then kept moving. Tape, pace, compass, breath. I counted in groups of 30 to keep my attention anchored. On the fourth group, the flute began. It wasn't loud. It never was, not at first. The melody came from nowhere and everywhere. A thin reed of sound threaded through the trees. In daylight it felt more wrong, the same as seeing frost on a summer leaf. The notes didn't line up with any pattern a body could play. There were breaths where breath shouldn't be. Rests placed not between phrases but inside them, like the idea of stopping had been misunderstood. I paused, made myself write the time in my notebook, 10:01 a.m., and the bearing, still 90 degrees. I wrote, too, that I did not feel watched. That was a lie I wanted to come true, so I wrote it neat. At the saddle the wind moved, and with it a smell, not smoke, not rot. Something mineral and metallic, like a penny on the tongue. A dozen low stumps ringed the clearing, each cut clean decades ago, the wood silvered and split. Some had small, bone, white objects set on them, arranged with careful spacing. At first I thought they were lengths of antler. Up close I saw they were pipes, flutes of some kind, carved from hollowed bone. Holes drilled along their length were plugged with wads of resin, worked over many times by fingers that did not quite understand round. The faint music seemed to come from these pipes, though no wind moved through. I touched one and it was cold, colder than the air, as if the bone remembered winter. I circled the clearing counterclockwise once, then clockwise, then set my hand on my compass and checked. Still east, still sane. On the far side, beyond the last stump, the ground fell away into a shallow depression lined with big, flat stones. A ring. The stones were darkened as if licked by heat, but when I reached to feel them, they were cool to the touch. The center of the ring was bare earth, tamped flat, smooth as a palm. At its center, a spiral had been pressed into the dust, the lines so straight, and even they looked drawn with a compass. The spiral turned inward and inward, and I felt that wrong direction current tugging at my eyes. I looked away, hard enough to make my neck hurt. In that look away, my gaze snagged on metal. A plaque half buried in the duff leaned against a stone. I brushed it clean. Letters emerged, stamped into tarnished brass, Garen P. Krapidar CCC 1936. Two more words had been scratched in crudely by hand at some later date. Duo. No object of the verb followed. Just duo nout. And a long gouge, as if the writer had been shoved mid-sentence. I lifted the plaque and discovered beneath it a rusted metal lid the size of a dinner plate, bolted to bedrot. A hinge let it tilt, though corrosion had sealed it closed. I didn't try to force it. My fingers pulsed without pain, a phantom heartbeat in the tips, as if the rocks themselves had a circulation. I don't know how long I stood debating the wisdom of opening, a thing someone once warned in brass not to open. I did not open it. I told myself that counted as rationality, and rationality meant safety, and safety meant survival at least until noon. I took one photograph in my mind, the ring, the spiral, the plaque, and then I marked the place on my map with a small X. I did not show the paper the respect of explaining. To my left, at the clearing's edge, hung something from a branch. A length of jute twine, frayed to brown hairs, held a small mirror no larger than a playing card. It was tied so it faced the ring. Sap had misted one corner, and trapped in the sap was a fly with its legs still extended, as if mid-flight. The mirror reflected a sliver of sky and the torn edge of a cloud. Even from an angle I could see the glass flecks, a trick of refraction or my nerves. The logbook entry came back, hard and cold. If the mirror is turned, don't look. I left it as it hung. My hands wanted to touch it with the force of an itch, and I did not scratch. 90 minutes comes quicker than you think when you keep promising yourself you'll leave in 10 more. I checked my watch. 86 minutes gone. I tied one last ribbon, a shout of orange in the green, and turned to follow my marks home. The first strip of tape fluttered in the same wind as my breath, and never looked so kind. I went from ribbon to ribbon, with the neat relief of a child reciting the alphabet in order. Somewhere between the 7th and 8th ribbon, distance went wrong. I could see the flutter of tape ahead, bright and crisp. Not far, only 30 yards, but the number of steps between me and it didn't change. I walked 30, 40, 60, counting with my breath, and the tape stayed 30 yards away, waving like a hand that did not mean hello. I laughed, a noise too loud in the quiet, and broke into a jog on principle. The tape approached, then saddled sideways the last 2 steps, and I was where I started. I tried another route, off my bearing a little, cutting a diagonal that would bring me to the same tree from a different angle. The air thickened like I'd stepped into shallow water. The needles underfoot resisted, gripping my soles. The flute music returned, distant but no longer atonal. No longer music either, just breath moving through a narrow aperture, in, out, around. I stopped without meaning to stop. My chest tightened. A long time later I realized I had held my breath to avoid breathing in time with it. I made myself kneel. I made myself dig a small hole with my knife and bury a coin, a token, a thing I could check later. When the hole was refilled, the ground looked untouched. There was no trace of the coin. I would have dug again, but my watch ticked, and my rule said 90 minutes. And when you are losing to a game that does not explain its rules, you do not cheat on your own. The 8th ribbon greeted me at last, not above me now but to my right. I did not argue with that change. I followed the tape to the 7th, to the 6th, to the 5th, counting backward like an antidote. The forest relaxed around step 4. The insects resumed their ordinary industry, their hum like wires strung between trees. A breeze rolled a sweet smell down from the ridge. A stand of fur warmed to resin. The 4th ribbon sighed. The 3rd fluttered. I touched the 2nd for luck, and then I saw the 1st, and through it, far off beyond the clearing, the tower. Seeing it did something complicated in me, like anger and relief shook hands and called a truce they did not intend to honor. The legs of the tower looked more like bones in daylight. Long, pale, jointed, anchored in concrete. The little square house at the top blinked with window glare. The rope I'd left coiled by the stairs was no longer a rope, but 3 neat loops, as if someone had practiced tying before doing the real thing. I hated the way that made me feel known. The clearing around the base was unchanged except where it was not. A fresh spiral had been carved into the dirt at the foot of the stairs, shallow but precise, like a signature. I walked around it rather than step across, as if the line might catch my boot like a tripwire. On the lowest riser sat a small object. I thought it was a pine cone until I was close enough to see the tool marks. It was a flute, no longer than my hand, whittled from bone so thin I could see light in the grain. Its mouth was stained pink, as if someone had pressed lips to it too hard. I did not touch it. I stood there in the heat, sweat cooling, eyes stinging from sun, and tried to do arithmetic how long I had been gone, how long it would take for something with long hands to shape bone. On the top landing the door waited, not scarred today, not scrawled, only there. I unlocked it, then paused with my palm on the wood. For the first time since arriving on Garnet Peak, I said aloud, to whatever would hear, "You cannot come in." The statement sounded absurd, like telling weather to stop. But I had to partition the world into what I permitted and what I didn't, even if the partition was drawn in chalk. Inside, the air was a little cooler. I set the compass on the desk, took the tin of mirror shards down, and held it to my ear like a seashell. No sound, only the faint tick of my pulse when the metal touched bone. I put it back. I drank water that had turned blood warm. At 9 o'clock the radio check came, the crackle like someone wadding dry leaves beside my head. Garnet report. Haskins board. Clear skies, no smoke, I said. My mouth added, "Wind light from the west," because that was true and facts still mattered. The response was delayed by a breath. Then another voice copied it, quieter, further away. A child repeating an adult, "Clear skies, no smoke. Wind light from the west." The radio clicked dead. I turned the volume knob until the needle shook, and it remained dead. I ate 3 crackers and a strip of jerky, and told myself it was enough for now. My plan had a step 5 not written down make sense. So I took out the old logbooks. I opened one not to where a ribbon once marked, but where the paper wanted to fall. The entry was dated 1978. The handwriting was tall, elegant, the lines straight as fence posts. New moon last night. Woke to tapping as usual. Considered staying quiet, considered answering. Did neither. Morning fresh ash at the base, no source of flame, no scent of smoke. Drew the circle deeper and replaced the mirror. The next page contained a diagram of the tower supports, each leg labeled with a little crosshatch where a spiral should be cut. A note at the bottom read, "Not decoration. Not art. Not mine either. We're only caretakers." The following page had a sentence that tightened every muscle in my back. "If one mark is broken, they can place a voice inside your mouth." I went to the window and checked the support legs from above. 8 spirals on 8 posts, evenly spaced like teeth. I counted them twice. The old log's diagram showed 10. My tower had 8. I didn't know if I wanted to find 2 more or to learn they had never been there. I closed the book carefully so as not to tear the paper. Afternoon dulled into a burnt gold. Heat thunderheads climbed the horizon, and then thought better of it and flattened. The flute did not sound, and the silence had the tense quality of a held breath rather than peace. I occupied myself with the job. Glass check, horizon scan, draw bearings to the white scars where old fires had licked and stuttered out decades ago. Once, on the far ridge, heat shimmer coalesced into a column of pale, moving light like smoke reversed, pulling downward instead of rising. Report if you must, I told myself, but don't apologize for what you see. I called it in. Garnet to base, possible smoke east, by southeast, faint. Static swallowed what might have been a response. I kept watching. The column narrowed and blinked out like a candle snuffed with wet fingers. I had decided I would not spend a third night pretending I had any control over the door. Pretend is a muscle. You can only use it so long before it shakes. Instead, I would throw myself at the one piece of the puzzle that felt like a thing a pair of hands could alter. The spirals kept something outside, or in. The logbook advised caretaking. So I uncoiled the rope, tied it around my waist and a anchor bolt in the floor, and lowered myself under the tower with the hatchet and a carpenter's pencil. The crawl space wasn't much of a crawl. The stilts left 6 feet beneath the house, airy, criss-crossed with bracing. Dust motes curved through slats of light like fish. The air carried that mineral taste again, pennies and wet stone. Up close, the carved spirals were precise, almost machine-cut. Each groove was the same width, the same depth, the same pitch as it turned. Like someone had once held a template against the wood. On the western leg, halfway around the spiral, a little notch interrupted the cut. Just a slip, nothing structural. The kind of blemish you'd ignore on furniture. But the wood at that notch was stained darker, not sap, something else sucked in by grain. The hair prickled on my arms. I pressed the pencil into the notch and shaded it, making the line continuous, not out of faith, but in the way you close a cracked window before a storm on the chance it matters. On the northern leg, a different flaw ran across the spiral at a shallow angle, as if someone had scored the wood later with a knife. I scraped the groove clean with the back of the hatchet and blew the dust out. It smelled like nothing living. I redrew the curve where it had been cut, the pencil leaving a dull black line in the pale wood. The entire time, I had the sense of being observed closely by someone trying very hard not to breathe. The urge to look over my shoulder was reptile deep. I resisted because I am not a reptile, and sometimes that's the whole victory. I found one leg whose spiral had been hacked crudely with fresh white cuts, the kind a dull blade leaves when the hand guiding it does not understand grain. That had not been there yesterday. I know this like I know my own name. I traced the fresh gouges and felt the wood thirsting around them. Thirsty the way a mouth is when the tongue has been sandpaper for days. I pressed the flat of my palm over the damaged place and whispered, "No. Because you use what you have, whether or not it's the right tool." Then I followed the scribed line and cleaned it, and closed it and redrew it. By the time I finished, my pencil was half its length, and the light under the tower turned the color of a bruise. I backed out, rope burning a stripe across my shirt, and sat on the bottom stair with my lungs shaking like paper. The flute stayed gone. The silence didn't applaud. At 6 the radio check came, and I almost didn't answer. Then I did, because obedience is another muscle. "Garnet, report. Clear skies," I said. "No smoke." A new voice broke in, female, smooth as something practiced on a different tongue. "Jonathan," she said, and the syllables went through the plastic not as sound but as shape. I held the radio far away, as if distance could shrink phonemes. "Jonathan, we are ready now." I pressed transmit without meaning to, and the button clicked, and I heard myself say into a dead mic, "I am not." The same voice answered, unbothered. "Enough watching. Come down." The radio light went out. It stayed out no matter how I turned the knob. The tower felt taller by a floor. I made coffee I did not want and sipped it until the cup was empty. I opened my notebook and wrote, in a hand suddenly steady, "I will not open the door after sunset." I wrote it again. The repeated sentence looked like lines a child does at school for punishment. The last line slanted toward the corner of the page. I shut the book and listened. Sunset hid itself in the haze. The world did not darken so much as lose temperature, the way a face looks when the person steps away and leaves the expression behind. The clearing gathered the gray the way a saucer gathers spilled water. The first sound was not steps or flute or tapping. It was breathing, not mine. The tower walls picked up the breath and repeated it, a stethoscope for the clearing. In out, in out. Something paced exactly the length of a man's stride beneath the knotted joists, in a perfect square. It paused at each corner, as if respecting geometry. When it reached the base of the stairs, it exhaled a sound that was not a word but held the posture of one. The doorknob turned. The handle depressed halfway and held. That was where it always paused. The voice that spoke then was not a whisper, but not loud either. It was the volume you use to speak to someone beside you at a funeral. "Jonathan," it said. You can hand me the tin, the tin. I had not thought of anything knowing about the box. I did not rise. Jonathan, it said again, coaxing now, a lullaby tone air on a lip of bone. The glass is heavy for you. I can take it. I can keep it turned the right way. The wrongness of those words was a wire pulled taut through my spine. No, I said, and my voice cracked. The knob eased back. A long, soft scrape whispered down the door. The thing at the base of the stairs went away 3 steps and returned 4, went away 5 and returned 3, making a little math I could not solve. Somewhere beyond the edge of the clearing, the flute's melody tried to begin and failed, and tried again, and failed, as if the mouth that played had been taught not to blow but to inhale. The night measured itself by each time I did not move. That is not meaning, it is counting. I counted until numbers lost taste. Around what must have been midnight, a light appeared in the woods to the east, a pale column like inverted smoke. It drifted closer, weaving between trunks, folding and unfolding like a sleeve of silk. No footfalls accompanied it. When it reached the clearing's edge, it stopped. I understood, with a clarity that felt gifted rather than earned, that if I stepped into it, I would go somewhere I could not return from. The light tilted, an invitation. I went to the far window and gripped the sill and felt the building's bones grieve that my fingers had nothing to carve. At some hour later than midnight, the tapping returned, but different. It came from the floor, not the door. A delicate knock-knock, as if from a polite neighbor under the boards. Then the faintest hum. A breath moving through a pipe, a room below me. I lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling and pictured the crawl space beneath the house, dark as a throat. I pictured 9 spirals neat and true, and 1 spiral cut wrong. I pictured a lid of metal bolted to bedrock, and brass letters telling me Dio Naut. I pictured a little mirror tied to a branch pointing inward instead of out, and a ring of stones holding cold like a secret. When dawn found me, it did so in pieces, in pale panes across the floor, like paper laid over a model. I stood, joints popping, and went to the door. The handle had been turned in the night and left that way, pointing at 5 o'clock. The wood held a new mark, a section of the spiral pattern I had redrawn beneath, copied here in shallow scratches, incomplete, wrong. I pressed my thumb to the glass of the north window and left a print. It was comforting to see evidence. I existed in ordinary ways. There was a shape at the foot of the stairs. For a foolish, waking second I thought it was the mule delivery at last, some bag of flour or carton of eggs. It was a bag, yes, but made of burlap, tied with twine gif. The knot was complicated, a fisherman's to a student's eye. I took the hatchet and cut the tie from the landing, and then I did not descend. I hauled the bag up like a fisherman unwilling to enter the water. Inside food, cans of beans and peaches, crackers in wax paper, coffee in an old tin. No note. Unless you count the thing at the bottom. A sliver of mirror. I did not touch it. I carried the whole bag to the far corner and set it down with the care you give a sleeping animal. I ate a peach like I had not earned it, juice down my wrist, pulp sugaring the air. The sweetness hurt. I wanted to weep and did not because weeping would salt me, and I did not want to be salt. When the radio check came, right on 9, the voice on the other end was Davis, the driver. "Morning, Mercer," he said, and cheer lived in his words like a borrowed shirt. "How's our sentinel?" I fumbled for ease. "Still here," I said. "Food arrived." "Thanks. We take care of our own," he said, then added, "We'll collect the tin on Thursday." A pause. "You can just set it on the top stair. Don't trouble yourself." I went cold in a way that had nothing to do with air. "What tin?" I asked, though the two of us knew which. "The mirror tin," he said, gentle, coaxing, like a man asking for a package he knows belongs to him. "That's ours. The radio clicked. The line went dead without static. For a long time the tower was very quiet. If I could claim one moment as the hinge, it was not the first footstep, or the white flame, or the mirror in the sap. It was the hour I spent sitting at the desk with the tin in front of me, the lid under my palm, thinking about what kind of caretaker I was. The logbook had called it caretaking, not owning. Care meant not just tending the marks, but refusing to hand over the tools by which the place was kept closed. I lifted the tin, walked to the hatch in the floor, where the maintenance ladder led to the underside, and set the tin on the wood above the square of dark. I said aloud, to the hatch, to the space beneath, to the wood that had learned the shape of my bare feet, this does not go out. Night will come again. It always does. I will redraw what they scrape. I will tape every reflective surface in this room until the place looks like I'm living inside a parcel. I will not turn any mirror hung in the trees. I will not open the door after sunset. If the breathing puts words in my mouth, I will grind my teeth until the words crack. This sounds brave and is not. It is only drawing smaller circles and hoping the center holds. But today, before the sun falls, I will go under the tower again. I will take the hatchet and the pencil and the rope. I will look for the 2 missing spirals in the old diagram, the ones that aren't on my legs. If I can't find them on the posts, I will look on the bedrock. If I can't find them there, I will look on the underside of the floorboards where the taps came from. If I find instead a metal lid bolted to the stone, with the CCC year rusting the hinge and the words "Dio Naut" still legible in grease and patience, I will not open it. I will not. But I will put my ear to it. If the sound underneath is the same flute that plays in the trees, I will know this is a circle and that what I am keeping out is what the men in 1936 kept in. If the sound underneath is my own breath, slowed and deep and patient, I will know it learned my cadence well enough to wear it. Either way, there is knowledge. Knowledge will not save anyone. It will only clear a corner of the glass. I stand now, set the notebook down, tie the rope around my waist. The hatchet hangs against my thigh. A small confidence. The light is good. The day is hot. I lift the hatch in the floor. The air that comes up tastes like coins in winter. I drop the rope through, then my legs, then myself, hand over hand, into the quiet under the house, where the wood smells like the inside of a cupboard and the earth smells like a locked drawer. My socks blacken on dust. The spirals wait. The bolt heads gleam on a circle of something buried. I crouch until my knees pop and place my ear to the metal. The cold climbs the bone of my skull. For 1 second there is only that cold and the small animal of my heart. For the next second the sound comes, faint, measured, as if someone very close and very far away is learning to breathe like me. The sound through the metal was my undoing. Not the pitch, not the tone, not even the rhythm. It was the familiarity. Each inhale, each exhale matched mine with mathematical precision, as though my lungs had been rehearsed from below for weeks. I pressed harder, irrationally wanting to catch the faintest imperfection that would prove it wasn't me, but the synchronicity held, the mirror rhythm impossible. And then, without warning, the breath below me paused while mine continued. The misalignment yanked every nerve in my body tight, like a violin string tuned past breaking. I staggered back, cracking my head against a joist. The sound beneath did not resume. The silence afterward was worse than the mimicry. I climbed the rope clumsily, palms burning, and slammed the hatch shut. I locked it, though the lock was no more than a loop of steel and a pin. The tower felt taller, emptier, and for the first time I wished it had solid walls, instead of windows on every side. I pulled the curtains tight, but daylight seeped around them anyway, bleaching the air into a pale, sickly glow. My notebook lay open on the desk. I wrote only one sentence. It was waiting for me to notice the difference. I avoided the hatch for the rest of the day, though my ears seemed tuned to its presence, catching every groan of timber, every shift of dust below. I tried to read, but the words dissolved. I tried to eat, but food turned to paste in my mouth. At 6 o'clock the radio crackled with the expected call. Haskins this time. Garnett? Report. My voice shook. Clear skies. No smoke. Static hummed. Then came a second voice layered under his. Whisper. Thin heavy smoke. Heavy smoke. I nearly dropped the handset. Repeat, I asked. Only Haskins answered, sounding bored. Copy clear skies. He clicked off. That night, nothing touched the door. But I did not rest. I sat with the hatchet across my lap and the tin of mirror shards at my feet, as though proximity to the thing I most feared could somehow render me immune. Near midnight, the breathing returned, not beneath the floor this time, but behind the walls. The tower has no walls thick enough to conceal a body, but the sound came anyway, moving clockwise from window to window, as if something circled the outer deck, leaning against the boards, exhaling. My heart stuttered with each pass. By dawn I was shaking so hard my teeth clicked. The food bag still sat in the corner. I forced myself to inventory it in daylight. Beans, crackers, peaches, coffee, all real, all ordinary, except for the mirror shard tucked at the bottom. I held it up once, accidentally catching my own reflection. My face looked stretched, lips pale, eyes sunken. For a flicker, another face pressed close behind mine, smooth where features should be. I hurled the shard out the window. It landed in the clearing with a dull glint and lay there like bait. I refused to retrieve it. The next days bled together. I tried to rebuild routine, radioing in, logging weather, redrawing the spirals where fresh gouges appeared each morning. They always returned marred, as if something tested them each night, scratching wrong angles, erasing portions of the line. Caretaking felt like patching leaks in a dam with my hands. I began to suspect that the tower itself was less a place of observation and more a lock, its structure a seal on something ancient beneath. The thought carried a terrible plausibility, as though the job I'd taken had never been about fire at all. On the 29th day, I heard voices in daylight. They came faint at first, from the eastern ridge where the ring of stones lay. I fetched the binoculars, though my stomach turned. Through the glass I saw figures gathered around the depression, pale and tall, their movements wrong. Their shoulders hunched too high, their arms too long. They passed something between them, lifting it toward invisible mouths. The faint piping music rose again. Only this time I saw the source bone flutes, lifted by featureless hands. Breath pulled through holes by lips that did not exist. The sight made my stomach lurch. I lowered the binoculars and swore never to raise them again. By evening, the figures were gone, but the ring of stones glowed faintly even from my tower. It pulsed like an ember, fading in and out, as though the ground itself exhaled light. I tried the radio. Only static answered, thick, wet static like bubbling tar. I threw the handset down. At midnight, the door rattled violently for the first time. Not coaxing, not polite, furious. The knob jerked, the hinges groaned, and fists or hands or something like them pounded the wood in rapid succession. My barricade shuddered. I screamed hoarsely, pressing my back to the door, hatchet raised. Between the blows came words, shouted, overlapping, "Let us in. Let us in. Let us in." The chorus rose, dozens of voices speaking in unison, until suddenly it stopped. The silence left my ears ringing. I slid down against the wood and wept into my knees until dawn. When I finally stepped outside, the clearing was a ruin. The spirals had been obliterated, carved over with jagged crosses. The soil was churned like hooves had trampled it, though no tracks remained. In the center of the clearing lay the tin of mirror shards, lid pried open, glass scattered. None of it glinted in the sun. Each shard had dulled to a gray sheen, as if the reflections had been scraped clean. I wanted to run. Every cell in me screamed for flight, to abandon the tower and take my chances in the woods. But when I looked toward the trail, the trees seemed closer, their shadows denser. A figure stood between the trunks, still and pale, watching. Another appeared further left. Then another. They lined the path in silence, their featureless faces tilted. The forest was no escape. I retreated up the stairs and locked the door again, knowing locks were theater. That afternoon, a helicopter droned faintly overhead. My heart leapt. I ran onto the deck, waving my arms. The machine banked once, circled, then flew on without lowering. I screamed until my throat tore. No one looked down. When it was gone, the silence pressed harder. Triumphant, I tried to plan again, as I had on that second week. Plans had saved me before. But each option collapsed. Stay and the nightly siege would grow until wood gave way. Leave and the forest would close around me. Signal and only static would answer. My notes blurred into frantic scrawl. Pages filled with spirals I had no memory of drawing. I tore them out, burned them, only to find new spirals etched into the desk itself, shallow grooves under my fingernails. On the 31st night, I dreamed, or believed I dreamed, that the hatch under the floor opened by itself. Cold air rose, carrying the metallic tang. A pale hand emerged, fingers impossibly long, gripping the rung of the ladder. I woke screaming, only to find the hatch closed, but the metal lock was unfastened. The next day, the ranger station finally called first. "Garnet, report," Haskins said. His voice sounded different, warmer, almost kind. I clutched the handset. "I need extraction," I said. "Now, today." There was a pause. Then he replied, "Of course. Just bring the tin down to the base of the stairs. That's all we need. After that, you can leave." I stared at the empty corner where the tin had once sat. "It's gone," I whispered. Silence stretched. Then his voice returned, colder. "Then you're staying." The line cut. Something inside me fractured. I smashed the radio against the desk until it broke into fragments. Static still hissed from the speaker, even after the circuit board cracked. I hurled the pieces out the window. They landed in the dirt below, where pale shapes bent immediately to retrieve them, cradling each fragment as though precious. That night the tower shook, not metaphorically. It swayed as though enormous hands gripped its legs and rattled. Dust fell from the ceiling. My teeth clacked. I screamed into the void, begging for it to stop, swearing I would not open, swearing I would burn the place down. At once the shaking ceased. Outside, dozens of figures stood at the clearing's edge, silent, heads tilted. One stepped forward and raised a hand, palm outward, in mockery of a wave. I collapsed on the floor, shaking, eyes burning. I don't know how much longer I can hold out. Supplies are nearly gone again. The spiral marks wear down faster each day, as though resisting me. The hatch creaks at night. My own reflection has begun to betray me, lips moving when mine do not. When I sleep, I dream of standing in the ring of stones, the flutes pressed to my mouth, playing breath that is not mine. I wake gasping, my lungs aching as though I've spent hours blowing into bone. I am writing this now as dawn breaks on my 33rd day. The clearing is empty, but I know that means nothing. The spiral on the north leg is broken again, deeper than before, as if carved from within the wood. The hatch is rattling even as I set these words down. I cannot ignore it much longer. I hear my name rising from below, whispered in the same cadence as my own breath. If the next part of this account is written, it will mean I opened the hatch, or it will mean something else opened it for me, and still put a pen in my hand. Either way, the truth of this place will not stay sealed. The tower was never a job, it was a bargain, and bargains always come due. I told myself I would do 3 things before I opened the hatch: The first was small. Drink the last of the coffee and keep the cup close, because the ordinary weight of a mug matters when everything else is unmoored. The second was practical. Go around the tower and redraw every spiral until the graphite in my pencil stained my skin. The third was a promise. If a voice asked for the tin again, I would answer it by name, my name, and refuse without apology. I repeated this list like an oath, while dawn scissored narrow beams across the floorboards and the hatch breathed in time with me. The pencil bit deeper than it had yesterday. It felt like filling cracks in porcelain with a dull needle, useless and necessary at once. I lowered myself beneath the house on the rope and worked from leg to leg, tracing the curves until the lines were whole. I whispered numbers as I moved. 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, an old trick from childhood to steady my hands. When I reached the western leg, my graphite met fresh, white wood where something had worried the spiral open again, and I pressed hard enough to snap the lead. The broken tip stuck in the cut like the point of a tiny spear. I left it there. I wanted the wood to choke on it. Back above, I stood over the hatch and felt the cold rise through the seam around it. The padlock lay beside the loop like a mouth missing a tooth. I tried to refasten it twice and failed. The hinge had bent, or my hands had forgotten the motion. I set the mug down, tucked the hatchet into my belt, and pulled the maintenance ladder up until the hatch lid was all that separated me from the room, where I had slept like a child the first 3 nights. Then I set my palm on the wood and said, "I'm coming down." I said it to myself as much as to what waited. Saying it made it a choice. The air below tasted like pennies, and water left in a coil of copper pipe. The ladder's rungs were cold enough to sting through my skin. When my feet touched the packed earth, the world above narrowed to a square of ceiling boards. Dust hung in the slats of light like lint trapped in a throat. The spirals cut into the legs glowed faintly where graphite darkened them, not with light, exactly, but with attention. You could feel where a line is unbroken the same way you feel a seam under a fingertip with your eyes closed. The bolt heads on the round steel plate in the ground were the color of old coins. I knelt and pressed my ear to the metal. The breath below matched mine for 2 inhales, 2 exhales, and then paused. Mine didn't. That stagger between us made my stomach clench, as though I'd misstepped on stairs I couldn't see. "Enough," I said, though I didn't raise my voice. The metal gave back a whisper of its own, not echo, but the suggestion of words forming just beyond hearing. I lay my palm flat on the plate. It was slick with condensation, like touching an animal that had been in the river. The bolts were old, but not as set as I had imagined. One had been backed off a quarter turn at some point. You could tell by the shine of the threads. My fingers found the looseness by instinct. It would have taken only a wrench and a willingness to disobey brass to lift the lid. I put my hand on the loosened bolt and did nothing. There are kinds of courage that are only different flavors of impatience. I do not flatter myself that I am brave. I was tired enough to be careful. Something scuffed the dirt just beyond the footprint of the tower. Not steps, the whisper of fabric or bark brushing against cloth. Then the softest knock against the cross, bracing of the legs, as polite as a collar. The bone, flute breath that always came at dusk pulled through a hole in the world and tried to begin, failed, tried again. No. I said to the plate, to the breath below, to myself, no to all of you. My voice sounded absurdly formal in the crawl space, like a man refusing a loan in an empty bank. I climbed back to the room and shut the hatch, sliding the pin through the loop, setting the bent padlock where a lock would be for a person who believed in locks. The radio squawked at 9 with a sound like dry leaves crushed in a fist. I lifted the handset and did not give my report. I waited. Garnet, Haskins said after a beat, but the name creaked, the way an old floorboard says hello when you step on it in the dark. Another voice slid under his like a blade under paper. Jonathan, it said, patient as a metronome. Bring the tin down to the base of the stairs. I stood very still. There is no tin, I said, and my mouth tasted like aluminum. The knot. Haskins took a slow breath through a reed. Then bring yourself. No, I said, and this time the word came out stronger.
No.
The radio went dead. Nothing hissed. The silence was deliberate. I could have waited, repeated the caretaking I had been doing, redrawn spirals, taped over reflections until the room looked like a package, prayed that the old strengths would hold. But there is a profession of despair that looks like patience. The spirals were wearing faster than I could darken them. The hatch knew my name. The ring of stones on the saddle pulsed, sometimes at night like a heart under thin skin. And there was the mirror hung from the branch with the fly in resin, a small insistence facing inward. The logbook's line bloomed unhelpfully. If the mirror is turned, don't look. It did not say don't turn it. It said don't look. I packed. Not to leave, because the forest would not let me, but to move with intention. I wrapped my hand in a bandana and picked up the bone flute someone had left on the lowest stair 3 weeks ago, the one with the mouth stained pink. It was lighter than I expected. Almost nothing at all. The way a bird's bone is so empty, it seems more architecture than matter. The holes had been punched irregularly, almost right, as if whoever made it had copied from a drawing, not a hand. I brought water, jerky, the hatchet, the rope, and a strip of duct tape for the mirror, because I believed in tape the way you believe in a friend who won't tell you you're wrong, only look at you long enough that you say it yourself. The clearing at mid-morning felt abandoned. Insects worked. Heat flared off the dirt. The spiral someone had scratched on the door last night looked like a child's imitation of handwriting. I walked east, counting steps, tying flagging ribbon every dozen paces. Not because I thought the forest would respect the trail I made, but because I wanted to lay a line that said I tried. The saddle welcomed me with that same unseasonable cool. The chemical copper smell, the ring of stones still dark from light that had licked them and gone. The mirror on its string hung where it had hung yesterday and the day before. Fly lacquered and sat by one wing, legs splayed as if still reaching for air. I did not touch the glass. I took the tape and folded a tab at the end so I could find it later by feeble. Then, without looking, I slid the edge between my fingers and the back of the mirror and wrapped it once, twice, 3 times. The way you bind a bandage on a finger you've cut slicing an onion. I rotated the mirror carefully on its string so that whatever it had faced before it now faced the other way. I did it by the tug of weight on the cord, by the little change in balance when the knot rolled over. I kept my eyes on the fly in the sap, which was not a reflection and therefore a mercy. When the mirror had turned half a circle and then a half again, I gently pressed the folded tab down to fix the tape. I looked nowhere except the knotted string, and the fly that would never free itself, and the pale skin under my own knuckles. There, I said to the empty grove, and I did not let myself look at what the mirror now showed. I stood at the edge of the stone ring and counted my breaths, slow. That 4-7-8 pattern you learn once when you can't sleep, and the internet tells you if you pretend to be calm long enough your body will do it for real. In for 4, hold for 7, out for 8. On the 5th cycle I lifted the bone flute and set it to my lip. It stank faintly of old saliva and a mineral as precise as blood. The mouthpiece was wrong, cut at an angle that wanted someone to inhale through it instead of blow. That made a kind of broken sense. A device for pulling a breath out, not sending one in. I put my mouth on it anyway, stubborn as a bad idea, and exhaled. The first note was not a note at all, only air hitting the sharp rim of a hole and shredding. The second made a thin whistle, off-pitch, like wind slipping through winter window frames. The third time I adjusted my jaw and my tongue, and the angle of my breath, the way you adjust when you're learning to do anything your body pretends is simple, but is not. A sound came that wasn't music and wasn't not. It was the sound of a boundary being taught to hold. The ring of stones shivered like a skin under a cold hand. The spiral in the dust at the center tightened by one concentric scratch, as if a finger had drawn it inward while nothing bent. I kept blowing. I did not stop for the 7 count. I blew until my eyes watered and my head swam, and spots danced like ash on the air. The woods did not like that. The trees answered not with wind but with absence of it. The light around me cooled and sharpened. On the western shoulder of the saddle, figures gathered without approaching, pale, too long in the limb. Heads canted as if listening with a part of the skull no doctor would name. They were not many, but they were enough to suggest many more behind them, and many more behind those. They did not move while I played. When I ran out of breath, the bone wanted to pull the last of it from me. I took the flute from my mouth and gasped, and the sound went out of it like a candle extinguished between wet fingers. Not yours? I told the ring, the stones, the figures, the mirror I refused to see. Not yours. The words were thin things to throw against a slope of dirt, but I threw them anyway, and then I did not wait to see if they stuck. I walked away the exact number of steps I had counted coming in. The first ribbon of orange, that was supposed to be 30 yards, stayed 30 yards, but this time the steps between us did change. The forest did not slide me sideways. The tape brushed my arm as I passed. I did not turn my head when something to my left matched my pace. I did not blink when the woods shared my breath for 3 inhales, and then lost it on the 4th. I did not look back. If the mirror on the string had turned its little face to follow me, I would not know. I had decided to live by a smaller set of facts. Back at the tower, the clearing looked different in the way a face looks different after you learn a secret about the person's childhood. Still the same skin and bones, the same eyes, the same mouth, but you can't see them without also seeing the thing they didn't say. The door bore a new mark. Not a spiral this time, but a straight line carved slowly down the grain, as if someone had wanted to learn what a straight line felt like to a hand. On the lowest stair, the place where the little flute had been, someone had left a coin. Not minted, no face, no year. A round of metal stamped with a spiral on one side and a circle of 10 hatch marks on the other. I did not touch it. I would have flung it into the brush if I had been a man who could leave a point unanswered. Instead, I went inside. At 6, the radio called. Not Haskins, not Davis, a voice without gender that wore syllables like borrowed clothes. Jonathan, it said, perfectly calm. We are ready now. I let the silence between us fill until the handset creaked in my palm. When I finally answered, my voice scraped from the part of me that still believed in rules. No. The mirror stays turned. The door stays shut. The voice did not imitate me. It did not plead. It did not threaten. It said, then breathe, and cut the line. Night lagged, as if the day had its foot on the hem of its coat. Heat thinned. The sky turned the fragile peach color of a bruise that's almost gone. I taped the windows, not to keep anything out, but to keep myself from looking. I set the mug on the hatch lid. I put the rope back on the maintenance ladder and looped the other end around my waist, a ritual of belonging to something that still held me up. I sat with the hatchet across my thighs and focused on counting mistakes I had not yet made. After full dark, the breathing began, not under the floor, not at the door, but in the corner of the room behind my left shoulder. A person standing there would have had their back to the north window. A person standing there would have left a shadow on the glass. There was no shadow. The breath matched me for 2 counts, and then seized the third for itself. I did not turn. A fingernail tapped the tin I no longer had. That was the first time the night mocked me like a child behind a couch that isn't big enough to hide him. Then the doorknob turned not halfway, not 3/4, but fully, and stopped against the latch with a damp click. The room smelled like pennies and pine pitch, and the inside of a paper bag humid with a person's breath. The deck boards outside groaned, as if someone very light had shifted their weight from one foot to the other to see whether the sound was the same each time. The radio, broken and scattered in the dirt an afternoon ago, squawked from nowhere, printing a sentence in a voice I almost believed was mine. Clear skies. No smoke. Then why are you here? I asked, to the dark, to the breath, to the thing that wanted me to make the last mistake. This time there was an answer. Not words. A sound like a finger tracing the inside of a shell. The hatch under my soles vibrated with it, and the bolt I had found a quarter, turned loose, ticked, as if it were the second hand on a clock that had been buried and forgotten. I put my palm on the wood and felt cold climb the bones of my arm. I moved my mouth to say no, and what came out was yes, because the power to decide which syllable leaves you is a measure. I opened the hatch. It was not a dramatic motion. A square of wood rose. Cold climbed. The dark below did not pour out, because dark is not a liquid. But it did something that my eyes interpreted as motion, even as they swore they could not see. The metal plate pulsed, not with light but with attention. The breath from beneath fixed on my face the way a dog will pick one person in a room to love or bite. Jonathan, the below said without sound and with all of it. Teach us. That was the wrong thing to ask. I do not know much. But I know that you do not teach something that learns faster than you and chews information like gristle and grows strong on it. I do not know much. But I know how to lie badly, and you can sometimes make a lie a bandage if you fold it enough times. I put my mouth to the hatch like a man sharing a secret across a pillow, and I breathed a rhythm that does not comfort the body. 5, 6, 5, 6, 7, 2, 7, 2, and I kept it for a long time. Long enough that my head ached and my hands shook, and I wanted to cough and sneezed and swallowed the sneeze. Because you do not interrupt a prayer, you pretend to believe in halfway through. The plate answered. It tried to keep the pattern and stumbled. It tried again and did not get better. It tried a third time with a weird determination that made me think of a child learning to tie a knot by muscle memory that was borrowed, not earned. Good, I said, because praise is a bruise that disappears slower than hurt, and I breathed wrong on purpose again. The thing beneath me did not like wrong. It knew the cadence of lungs because it had been measuring mine for a month. It knew the length of my exhale and the hitch when I woke from a bad dream and the shape of the breath I took before saying no. But it did not know the bad rhythm that does not relax a person. The one you use when you're 12 and you're trying not to hyperventilate in the nurse's office because your heart forgot math. I gave it that. I gave it the miscount and the stumble, and the thing that repeated could not repeat it and remain itself. The ring of stones on the ridge, unseen but felt, skinned light off its own edges. Somewhere in the trees, flutes tried to play and made no pitch at all. Only the rush of wind arsing around a hole that had not been placed in the right place on purpose. The deck creaked, and all at once whatever stood outside rethought its geometry. The steps away were not footsteps, but the sound of absence moving, and then there were none. I did not close the hatch. I did not stop breathing wrong. Tears ran sideways along my face into my ear. After a long time, the cold through the woods subsided to something I could have mistaken for cool if I had been a person in a different room, in a different summer. The loose bolt ticked one last time and fell still. When daylight shoved its shoulder under the horizon, I stood and knelt and shut the hatch. My hands shook too much to get the pin through the loop the first 3 tries. On the 4th it slid home with an obedient click that made me laugh in a way that sounded like a cough. I sat on the floor with my back to the closed square and watched light widen on the opposite wall. Outside, the clearing had changed. The spiral marks at the bases of the legs were unmolested. The coin on the bottom stair was gone. The dirt at the foot of the tower held prints that were not elongated, not hands, not hooves, but the flat, ordinary ovals of boots. They stood in a pair for a while, then walked away and did not return. At 9 the radio spoke in Haskins' voice so convincingly that for a moment I believed in men again. "Garnet, report." "Clear skies," I said, and my mouth, "Traitor and friend," added no smoke. There was a pause long enough for me to know he was listening for more. Then, "Kopi," and the easy crackle of a man who has already reached for his coffee. "We'll rotate you out next week," he said, and whatever else he meant by we I chose not to hear. I said, and looked down at the hatch while I said it. I did not leave that day. I did not leave the next. I redrew spirals. I turned every reflective thing to the wall and taped a square of paper over it. I took the bone flute into the clearing and broke it carefully into 3 pieces and buried them at the feet of 3 different trees I could find again without ribbon. I did not go to the ring, and if the mirror on the string had any opinion about the direction it faced now, it would have had to send a letter. The nights were not quiet. Things tried the door in the small hours with the patience of water. Once, something tapped 3 short, 2 long, 3 short on the window, a signal I refused to translate. But no voice spoke my name in the hinge of my breath, and the hatch did not rattle like a jar you shake to see whether what's inside is coins or screws or teeth. The cold stayed in the metal where cold belongs. On the 36th day, Davis came up the trail with a mule. He wore his usual quiet like a coat that fit him. He set the flour down, and the eggs, and the coffee, and he did not look at the hatch. "How you holding up?" he asked, and I heard in the question the part he didn't ask. "What did you open? What did you close? What did you feed it? What did it feed you?" I said, "Nuff." He nodded, and for a moment something took his face off him and folded it into his hands and put it back on wrong. Or maybe I had a blink too long. He asked, "Any trash?" And I handed him the bag with the broken radio pieces inside. He tied it to the mule without curiosity. He said, "Thursday, collection for the, salvage," and I pretended not to understand. When he turned to go, he didn't say take care. He said, "Keep count." After he left, I opened the logbook and wrote what I wish had been written for me. Not poetry. Not warnings clever enough to be ignored, because cleverness looks like superstition in a uniform. I wrote instructions and called them that. Redraw the spirals every morning before 9 and every night before dusk. If one is cut wrong, don't complete the wrong lines. Clean and recut them right, even if the wood complains. Keep the mirror on the string turned outward, and do not look at it. If anyone on the radio asks for a tin, say you don't have it even if you do. If they ask for you, tell them you are busy and don't apologize. If the hatch breathes with you, breathe wrong. Prime counts work well. The thing that repeats hates mistakes. Don't be perfect. Take shallow breaths when you must, but count them like you mean it. Do not open the door after sunset. Do not answer the tapping with tapping, not even as a joke. If you see a coin with 10 hatch marks, leave it where it lies. If you're going to cry, cry on the north side of the tower, where no one can see you from the ring. I drew the diagram again, the one from 1978 with 10 spirals, and I wrote in the margin where I thought the other two had been. On the underside of the floor, not on the legs. I cut them there with the tip of my knife. Shallow and careful, apologizing to the grain while I did it. I wrote the brass words the CCC had stamped, and added the words no one had finished de Donaut. Turn your face toward what wants to borrow it. I signed my name, not because I wanted credit, but because someone should know a person had stood here and tried. The summer kept going. Heat pulsed in the afternoons. Storms threatened, and then went to bother other ridges. Twice more the helicopter circled, and both times it flew on. The figures at the edge of the woods kept their distance, interested the way a fox is interested in a henhouse that has learned to latch itself. At night the column of pale, not smoke rose beyond the saddle and hovered, but it did not cross the clearing. When it leaned, the mirror on the string faced it and did not break. On the last Sunday of July, Haskins did rotate me out. Davis came with the mule, and a second man I didn't know, and between them they acted out normal so well that if they had been in a play someone would have written good review copy about their chemistry. I walked down the stairs. I locked the door behind me out of habit, though the habit sat thin on the bone. At the base of the steps I paused and looked at the spirals scratched in the dirt. They looked back the way writing does when you come back to an old notebook and remember your own hand younger. I put the hatchet in my pack and the rope, and I left the pencil on the bottom step for the next caretaker, a small stub etched with the seam of my thumb. "Ready?" Davis asked. I shouldered the pack. The other man took the lead. The trail that had once been lined with figures was only a trail. We walked through it. The forest did not lean in. At the ridge I turned and looked back at the square of glass at the top of the bones. Sun caught the windows and threw me my own light. For a moment the reflection lagged, the way a cheap stream on a bad connection stutters a second behind the man's mouth. Then it matched. I told myself a second is not a story. We kept walking. At the station, Haskins nodded without standing. "Good season so far," he said. Because that's what a man in a chair says when he doesn't want to talk about the smell of pennies on your clothes. He ticked boxes. I signed things. "You'll write up observations," he said. "Keep it clean." I did not ask which kind. I went to the bathroom, looked at my face in a mirror someone had not turned, and counted 3 breaths before it did what mine did. I did not look again. The coffee in the break room tasted like memory. I drank it anyway. I wrote this account because I would have wanted to read it before I took the job. I do not know if truth helps. It is not my experience that truth makes anyone safer. It changes what you're afraid of, that's all. I never saw a wildfire all summer. I learned how a tower sways in wind, and how far sound travels from a ring of stones, and what happens to a man's breath when he lets something else borrow it. I learned that caretaking is not the same as owning, and that locks are theater, and that a mirror, if treated with respect, is a shield you use by pointing it where you won't look. I learned that if a thing asks you to teach it, be careful what part of yourself you offer as curriculum. When I got home, I slept on the floor for a week with a fan at the foot of the mattress, so that the air on my face would feel like wind and not breath. I taped over the mirror in the hallway and left the bathroom mirror turned. I taped a little tab on the tape so I could remove it for guests. But I have not had guests. I keep a pencil in my pocket, and my mouth writes numbers on my breath when I climb stairs. 2, 3, 5, 7, because superstition is just practice that has survived its reason. Sometimes in the middle of the night, I wake convinced I can hear the hatch clicking 2 towns away. It is most likely a pipe in the wall. I lie still and breathe wrong for a while anyway. It is a kind of prayer, or a habit, or an apology. I do not know if the tower on Garnet Peak is safer now than it was when I arrived. The spirals hold. The mirror faces outward. The coin with the 10 hatch marks has not reappeared on the stair. A person whose voice sounded like mine told me on the radio that the weather looked good, and then it did. The next kid who takes that job will pour coffee into the same dented pot and read the same crude notes and decide whether to believe any of it. Maybe she'll think the man who wrote it was lonely and tried to invent company. Maybe she'll hear tapping and tell herself it is the tower cooling after heat. Maybe she'll breathe wrong when the hatch breathes right, and maybe that will be enough. If she turns the little mirror, I hope she doesn't look. If she hears a voice ask for a tin, I hope she refuses like she was taught to refuse some other thing, some other place, long before she ever climbed those stairs. I do not plan to go back. I know that statement has no weight in the world. The world will call when it wants you. Bargains do not annul themselves because you changed your mind. But for now, there is a tree outside my apartment that throws a ragged shadow on the wall around noon, and when the wind moves through its leaves, the shade breathes in time with mine for 2 counts and then loses me on the 3rd, and that is enough to make soup and do laundry and not put the tape over the mirror for a whole afternoon. I do not go into antique stores because of the mirrors. I do not answer numbers I don't recognize because of the radio. I keep count. I keep breath. I look at nothing that asks too nicely to be looked at. If you read this and take the job anyway, understand this: you are not there to watch for fire. You are there to hold a line that men with their hands in 1936 cut into the world and ask the world to respect. You will not be thanked. You will not be believed. If a thing tells you you are ready, it means it is ready. Tell it no the simplest way you can. Redraw the marks. Breathe wrong. Turn the mirror the right way and keep your eyes on the fly. I think the tower is a lung. I think the ring is a mouth. I think the breath below the hatch is not a monster in the way that word is convenient. I think it is a memory of people who died in the wrong shape and learned to use the shape left. I think it wants to be in our mouths so that it can learn to say what it remembers. I will not help it. I will not be the man who teaches the wrong thing how to talk. I have told the truth as plain as I can. If it comes to your door and turns your handle halfway and holds it there and says your name, say no. It will be patient. Be stubborn. Stubbornness is only patience with a backbone. Count whatever you can count. And if you must open anything, open your mouth long enough to breathe like a bad student until the thing that repeats forgets how to copy you. The last time I dreamed about Garnet Peak, I stood in the clearing at noon and held a cup of coffee and watched my reflection arrive in the window a second late. In the dream, I did not panic. I raised the cup and waited for the glass to catch up, and when it did, I nodded to it like an acquaintance. You could have been a friend within a different life. When I woke, I could not tell if the nod had felt like victory or truce. Maybe those are the same. Maybe that is what caretaking is. Agreeing to live beside a thing without making it your own. I got out of bed and taped the hallway mirror again. And the tape made a small sound like a lid sealing, and I breathed a pattern I would not teach a child and counted in prime numbers all the way to coffee. My name is Victor Hale, and I was raised with a quiet respect for the forests of Appalachia. The Monongahela National Forest had been a backdrop to my childhood and my adulthood alike, a stretch of land that to outsiders looked endless and inscrutable, but to those of us who grew up nearby, It was as familiar as the worn wood of a front porch. I am 38 years old, an accountant by trade, though I have always believed my true refuge lies not in numbers or spreadsheets, but in the hush of trees and the low music of rivers. To introduce myself with honesty is to confess that my life has been unremarkable in many respects. Steady job, quiet house, friendships that wax and wane with the seasons. But all of those things, stable though they are, became small and fragile the moment I leaned against a sycamore tree one May afternoon and saw, with my own eyes, bark peel back into a smile full of teeth. The words I set down now carry the weight of memory, sharpened by the knowledge that I am alive to tell it, while others might not be so fortunate. This account, written with the care of someone who wishes to leave behind an accurate record, contains approximately 1,500 words, though each one feels inadequate to describe what truly happened. Still, it is the only way I know to capture the terror. The day had begun as innocently as any other. Fishing had been my pastime since boyhood, an activity that demanded patience, quiet, and a willingness to surrender to nature's rhythm. That afternoon, the river ran clear and cold, glinting beneath a sky patched with clouds. I parked my truck on a dirt pull, slung my tackle box over one shoulder, and followed a narrow path that threaded down toward the water. Spring had coaxed every shade of green from the trees. The sycamores stood tall and pale, their mottled bark shedding like flakes of paint, their roots reaching down into mud the way a hand grip the edge of a cliff. The air smelled of damp soil and blooming weeds, and the only sound was the trickle of current over stone. I remember the ease of it. I baited my hook, cast the line, and settled against a broad sycamore, one of the largest along the bank. Its trunk was thick enough that it would take two grown men with outstretched arms to encircle it. The bark was a patchwork of ivory and gray, curling in places as if the tree were in the midst of reinventing its skin. My back pressed against the rough surface, the sun warming my face. Time in the forest had a way of stretching thin, minutes pulling like taffy, until I could not say whether half an hour or two had passed. I dozed lightly in that way only possible near water, lulled by its ceaseless motion. When I opened my eyes again, the light had shifted, and I happened to glance upward. That was when I noticed it. The section of bark directly above me had peeled in an arc, curling back to reveal a dark interior. It looked, at first, like nothing more than an odd shape, a fissure patterned by nature. But then the bark shifted, flexing as if on hinges, and I realized with a sick drop of my stomach that the shape resembled a grin. What had peeled was not random. The pattern was deliberate. A row of jagged white ridges gleamed where bark should have been smooth. They were uneven, sharp, and they caught the late sunlight the way enamel does. I froze, the fishing rod slipping sideways in my hands. The grin widened, and in that instant I understood those were teeth. The sycamore was chewing. Chips of its own bark cracked between the white ridges, splintering with a sound so soft it might have been mistaken for the creak of branches in the breeze. But there was no breeze. The air had gone utterly still, heavy, and every hair on my arm stood on end. I could not breathe. I could not believe. Yet the evidence was in front of me, a living tree, revealing not only teeth, but the act of using them. The grin worked slowly, methodically, as though savoring its own skin. A shudder went through me, and I lurched to my feet, stumbling backward, the fishing rod clattering to the ground. My first instinct was to laugh at myself, to dismiss what I had seen as a trick of light and shadow, the daydream of a man too long alone in the woods. But laughter would not come. My throat was locked tight. I took another step back, and the grin stilled. The teeth paused mid-chew. The peeled bark flexed slightly, the way lips might when pressing into silence. And then the grin tilted, adjusting downward, as though the entire face of the tree had bent to regard me. I have no way to prove this detail except my memory, but I swear that the eyes of the tree were knots I had not noticed before. Two dark whorls positioned just above the grin. They glistened faintly, wet as if with sap, and they were watching me. Every instinct told me to run. Yet the forest around me had gone strangely unfamiliar. The path back to my truck hidden by undergrowth that seemed denser than before. My pulse hammered in my temples. I could not decide if moving would provoke the thing into action, or if standing still would allow it to grow bold enough to act first. Seconds passed like hours. I tried to swallow, and my throat made a sound too loud in the hush. The tree's grin twitched wider. Chips of bark spilled down like crumbs from a meal. I staggered to the side, choosing a direction at random, my boots catching on roots. The forest felt altered, the air too thick, my own breath ragged. Behind me came a creak, long and slow, the unmistakable groan of wood bending. I looked back against my better judgment and saw that the sycamore was not standing as it had been. The trunk was leaning. It tilted fractionally forward, toward the space where I had been standing. Roots strained upward from the soil, clods of dirt dropping as though the tree had begun to pull itself free. I do not know how I remained upright. I stumbled farther, branches whipping at my arms, and when I finally found the faint trace of the path again, I ran until the river was a whisper behind me, and the only sound was the pounding of my heart. It took me nearly 10 minutes to reach my truck, though it felt like hours. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and sat gripping the wheel with hands that shook so violently the keys rattled. I told myself over and over, trees cannot move, trees cannot chew, trees do not smile. But my mind replayed the grin, the glistening teeth, the creak of roots tearing free. I drove home in a daze, not trusting my eyes, half expecting to see the pale trunk of reflected in my mirrors, following me down the highway. Only when I reached the edge of town did I breathe again, but even then, the relief was temporary. For days afterward, the memory stalked me. I dreamed of teeth grinding through wood, of the walls of my bedroom flexing into grins. I woke with the taste of bark in my mouth, though I had eaten nothing of the sort. Friends noticed my distraction, but I could not explain. Who would believe it? A man leaning against a tree that chewed its own skin. They would laugh, or worse, they would think me unwell. I tried to bury it, but the image would not fade. And worse, part of me wondered if I had only seen the beginning. The grin had paused when I moved, as though testing me. What would have happened had I not left? That question rooted itself in me, deeper than any tree could plant itself in soil. On the 5th night, I woke to a sound outside my house. My property sits at the edge of town, with a stand of maples and sycamores behind the yard. The noise was faint, a cracking like wood splintering under weight. At first, I told myself it was wind. But when I went to the window, the trees were still. The sound came again in chew, chew, chew. I closed the blinds with trembling fingers, unwilling to look longer. Sleep did not return. When dawn came, I found bark chips scattered across my back porch, though no branch hung above it. My breath stuttered in my chest, and I realized the forest had not let me go. The grin had followed me home. I swept the chips into my palm and felt the sting of fine splinters working under my skin. They were too fresh to be from old rot, and too many to be the work of a single squirrel. The porch boards bore a dusting of pale crumbs, as if something had eaten in a hurry and forgotten to clean up. I stood very still and listened. The Sunday quiet lay over the yard, a tentative stillness that made every small sound feel important. Somewhere a mourning dove called. Farther off, a truck downshifted, then faded. No wind, no sway, nothing to blame, but the word I did not want to say, teeth. I did not call anyone. I put the broom to the boards, swept the mess into a dustpan, and dumped it into the trash like a man tidying away a bad thought. Before leaving for work, I walked the perimeter of the house and peered at the trees. My lot backs onto a strip of county land, where the old farm fence still runs half, buried in honeysuckle. There are 3 sycamores within sight of the porch, each tall and mottled, each with bark that naturally peels in wide plates. I had seen those plates countless times, like flaking paint on a high ceiling. That morning they all looked the same. After a minute, I realized I was not breathing right. I forced a long breath in and out and told myself I was being foolish. At the office, numbers refused to behave. I corrected the same column 3 times because I kept hearing that faint chew, 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 as if somewhere between my ears something was grinding down patience into pulp. Twice, I caught myself staring at the wooden edge of my desk, convinced I would see new marks. Nothing changed. My coworkers asked if I was coming down with something. I said no and smiled more than I felt like smiling. The day burned by in fluorescent light. When I finally drove home, the sun had already dropped below the high roofs of the neighborhood, painting everything a low gold that made the sycamores behind my yard look like the bones of giants. I parked and killed the engine and sat a long minute with my hands on the wheel. The yard waited. At last I stepped out. Gravel popped under my boots. Too loud, too deliberate. I went around back and stood in the grass and saw that the broom could not keep up with what the night had done. More chips lay scattered along the steps, and a ragged crescent had appeared on the right, hand porch post at about the height of my chest, as if someone had pressed a row of chisels into it, then worried the wood until it frayed. I set my fingers on the marks without meaning to, the same way a tongue will hunt a broken tooth. The grooves were shallow but clean. The wood smelled green and wet inside. Though it had been dry for years, I told myself it could have been a raccoon. I told myself it could have been a prank. The part of me that still believed the world had rules suggested a simple test. I went inside, set out a dish of peanut butter on the steps where Raccoon could not resist it. And because this is the age we live in, I mounted an old trail camera under the eave, angled down across the porch and out toward the tree line. I had bought it years ago during a phase when I wanted to catalog the deer that slipped through at dusk. It had seen more dust than use, but it still powered on. The little red light blinked. I shut the door behind me, left the porch light off, and sat alone in my kitchen with the window, blind raised, feeling like a man who had baited a snare, and then realized he was not sure which of them would be trapped. Night made the yard a flat sheet of black. The camera emitted a faint buzz I had never noticed before, a noise I could only hear when I pressed my ear to the glass. In the refrigerator light, I found I had no appetite. I washed the coffee cup anyway. I read the same paragraph of a book 3 times. Around 11, I turned out the house lights and let the dark settle proper. I lay on the couch with the window in view and told myself I would stay awake. At some point I slept. I woke to the sound that had pulled me from sleep. Many times before, wood under strain, a long, slow complaint. At first I thought it was the frame of the house changing temperature. Then I heard the chew, 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 close enough that it seemed inside the room. I sat up and my back prickled with cold. The window showed the yard in a grainy grayscale, the trail camera's infrared spill making the edges of the porch glow. The dish of peanut butter was a small pale circle on the top step. The steps were crowded with motion. No animal, no person, but the faint swirling of something like dust that then settled, and then rose again, as if breath were moving the chips. I went to the door against every good sense I possessed. I eased the lock back, turned the knob, and opened onto a silence that struck me as rude. Nothing moved. The dish sat untouched. But in the second before my body blocked the camera, I saw the trees at the edge of the yard lean forward. Just a fraction, as if they had been caught looking and wanted to pretend they had not. I shut the door and stood with my hand on the knob until my palm hurt. When I could make my fingers work, I brought the camera in and connected it to my laptop at the kitchen table. The files loaded slow. The first clips were nothing but moths and the night drift of air. The timestamp rolled through midnight and on toward 1. A fox slipped past in the far corner of the yard and never once looked toward the house. Sometime after 2, the frame jerked. A glitch that lasted less than a second. A smear, then a snap back into clarity. I rewound and slowed the footage until the long smear became frames I could step through. In a single progression, the 3 sycamores behind the fence appeared an inch closer than they had been in the shot before. In the next, closer still. Between frames, they moved. Not in the wind. Between the ticks of the machine's heart. I told myself there had to be another explanation. A shifted tripod. A mislogged format. I checked the mounting solid. I scrolled on. At 2:13:47, something entered the lower edge of the frame from above. It was small at first, a dark crescent I took to be a shadow. Then it uncurled and showed pale, ridged surface. It was bark, or something like bark, peeling itself into a shape like a lip. Beneath it, scalloped whiteness. The angle was bad and the light worse. But there was no mistaking the motion, a mouth opening, closing, opening again. The way a fish will work a piece of bread until it surrenders. I watched the mouth close over the edge of my porch post, and I saw the post tremble in the same slow beat I had heard. The camera had no sound, but I felt each chew in my jaw. I shut the laptop because I could not stand to have the image inside my house any longer. I went to the sink and ran the tap and washed my hands though they were not dirty. Water thundered against the steel basin, too loud for the hour. When I turned it off, the kitchen filled with a quiet that felt crowded. Something tapped the window once, twice, a polite request to be let in. I did not move. The third tap sounded lower, not at glass height anymore, but closer to the floor, right where the wall met the cabinets. The house answered in its language, a low ripple in the studs like a held-in breath. I backed into the hallway with the certainty, a man who has just realized that the walls around him have more life than he does. Sleep came in ugly pieces and left me raw. I phoned a ranger station after 8, a number I had from a pamphlet about burn bans. A woman with a voice that made me picture flannel, and a calm scene. All gaze listened without interrupting. She asked for my name and address, and whether had taken any substances that might alter perception. I told her I had not. After another pause, she said, sycamores exfoliate their bark in sheets, and that wildlife sometimes worries at it for insects and sap. Perfectly normal. I thanked her and hung up and stared at the phone in my hand for a long, childish minute in which I wanted someone to tell me I had made a small mistake that could be put right with a pamphlet and a shrug. That afternoon, I took a drive to clear my head and found myself pulled toward the river almost without intending it. The same pull, off-weighted. The same path dropped toward the same water. I told myself I would stand at a distance, that I would put eyes on the place where my ordinary life had cracked, and then go home and be done with it. The forest did not argue. It accepted my presence the way a pond accepts a stone, with the polite ripple that says you were never going to change me. The big sycamore by the bank stood like a pillar. I stopped well short of leaning against it. The bark looked odd in the afternoon light, the plates paler, the pattern more deliberate. I realized my hands were clenched and forced them open. I said aloud, because speaking proves the speaker exists, I see you. The wind did not carry my words anywhere. The water kept its counsel. A faint smell of sap reached me, sweet and wrong. The grin did not present itself immediately. The tree held its shape like a patient liar. Only when I stepped to the side did the light make the peeled arc clear. It relaxed open with the slow care of a jaw that has learned to speak softly. White ridges showed. Something inside gleamed wet. When the mouth closed, it made a noise I felt more than heard, the click of wood against something like enamel. I should have run. Instead, I found I was angry. It was a small anger, the kind a child feels when a bully smirks. I said, still as calm as I could, "You followed me." The grin twitched the way lips do when they hold back a word. A chip of bark dropped and landed between my boots. That is what did it. The neatness of that gesture. The care. I stepped backward until my heels found the path, and then I kept stepping until the truck appeared through the trees. And then I drove. And the whole way home the rear view held. White flashes where no trunk should be. Glimpses of pale skin moving between houses, as if the road ran through an orchard of bodies. I did not go to work the next day. I stayed home and put salt along the threshold because I had once read it helped and I needed to do something that looked like action. I set the trail, camera on the inside of the kitchen window facing out. I took a hammer and drove nails through a 2x4 and set it beside the door, not because I believed it would help, but because something in me insisted on the comfort of tools. I waited. The day held like thin glass. Evening blue came and went. Crickets began their work. At 9, I turned off every light and stood in the edge of my living room with the yard, a darker rectangle beyond the glass. I told myself I would not open the door again. The first movement was not at the trees but at the fence. A post at the far corner leaned forward degree it had not a moment before. Then another leaned, and another, as if a wave passed along them. The fence wire tightened, sang a low note, and then went slack. The post settled in a new angle, like a row of onlookers craning for a better view. I could make out the pale patches of sycamore bark beyond them, and the longer I looked, the more those patches resolved into shapes the mind knew how to interpret. A tilt like a jawline, a curve like a cheek, the grain where lips might be. One mouth opened, then another. I could not count them because the yard had no depth anymore. The night made it a stage with the curtain torn open. Something touched the outside of the door at knee height. The wood flexed a little. The sound it made was private and intimate, like a finger drawn along a tooth. I put my hand on the knob and felt it move against me in tiny pulses, the way a cat pushes at a hand to insist it be noticed. I stepped back and the pressure increased, not hard enough to break in, just enough to say, "I am here." The chewing began again, louder than the first night, and this time it was not a single rhythm, but many mouths working at once, a choir of patient grinders, reshaping what the world is made of. The smell of sap thickened until I could taste sweetness I did not want. I went for the back hallway, for the bedroom where the second-story window looks over the trees. The stairs creaked. Halfway up, I realized the creak did not stop where my foot left the board. It continued under me and ahead of me, a ripple traveling through wood. I froze and the house stilled with me in a way that felt like obedience. In the bedroom, the window gave me the broad view. I had not realized I had feared more than anything. The sycamores were closer to the house than they had been at dusk. Not a yard closer, not a foot. Closer by an amount that made the mind reject the measurement and the body accept it. Their trunks were not straight anymore. They bowed in at the top like old women, leaning to hear a child. The mouths were open. They were not all teeth the way an animal's are. The white ridges arranged themselves in unique patterns, some cross-hatched like worn molars, some pointed like the tips of shells, some broken and regrown in a way that made my gums ache in sympathy. In the nearest trunk, the mouth was too wide. I saw the line of it crack beyond its old seam, the way a smile can split dry skin. Sap beaded and ran the way spit does. When the mouth closed, the trunk shivered, and the leaves on that tree trembled though no wind moved any others. I understood then that the mouth was not special to that tree. It was the tree, the way the bark is not clothing but skin. They did not rush. They did not need to. The fence had leaned to watch. The posts were smiling now too. Plates of old stain lifting into shapes. I could no longer pretend my mind was inventing. I put my forehead against the cool glass and closed my eyes and said, as quietly as I could into the pain, "Please." I had not known I would say that word. It was the right one. A leaf tapped the window as if in answer. A second leaf brushed the glass lower, then a third, as if the tree were learning how to touch a house. I woke on the floor with dawn inside the room. The trail camera sat dead, eyed on the sill where I had set it. Its battery light blinking a warning that knocked all night and had nothing left. Outside, the trees stood as they had always stood, innocent and tall and patient. On the porch steps, the dish of peanut butter remained. It had been pushed several inches to the right by something that could not grip it. On the top of the dish, the smooth surface was interrupted by a single groove the width of a fingernail, curved the way a lower lip curves when it drags through a soft thing. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to burn the yard. I made coffee and poured it into a travel mug and stood at the back door with my keys in my hand. Work, I told myself, because sometimes a routine is the rope you pull to get out of the well. Before I could turn the knob, something on the outside spoke, not in a voice with consonants but in the thin, patient friction of wood against wood. My name shaped itself in the grain of the door. Not said. Suggested. I felt each letter under my palm. When I pulled my hand away, it spoke again. The syllables were almost there. I felt them in my bones, like the hum you feel in your jaw after the dentist has used the drill. The mouth on the other side of the wood did not need breath. It had all the time in the world, and I had given it a threshold to practice on. I kept my hand on the wood until I could name the tremble in my bones for what it was: recognition. The door spoke my name because it had learned the shape of it in grain and pressure. It had been practicing, worrying the syllables the way a mouth learns a whistle. That thought cleared me more than coffee could. I left the door where it was, went out through the garage with its rolled steel, and drove with no destination beyond a way. Sun lay bright on the roofs of town. People walked dogs, carried groceries, waved at neighbors, the world behaving as if it were the same place it had been yesterday. But every telephone pole seemed a shade closer to the street than I remembered. I kept glancing at them, and then at the gaps between them, and my eyes watered with the strain of trying to catch movement that had no frames to exist in. At the hardware store, I bought a steel slab meant for a security door, a box of masonry screws, and 2 sacks of dry mixed concrete. The clerk asked if I was replacing a threshold, and I said yes. He made a joke about beavers I tried to laugh at and could not. I added 3 solar lights to the pile because it felt like a thing a sensible person would buy. When I got home, the porch looked like the smile of someone ashamed of their teeth. The ragged crescent on the post had deepened. The top step had a clean groove in it, curved as if a lower lip had dragged through powdered sugar. I should have checked the camera first. Instead, I carried the steel plate to the door and held it up, and realized what my fear had been trying not to say. A veneer is nothing to what lies under it. Walls do not stand by private pact. They stand by studs, and studs are bones of wood. I still mounted the plate. I still swept the chips and mixed concrete in a black tub, and troweled a new skirt along the sill the way I had seen done in videos. I did it because hands that do not work will shake themselves loose from the body. By the time I finished, my shirt stuck to me and my breath was a metronome. I locked the metal against the wood, and for a moment admired the lie of safety it made. Then I went to the window to fetch the camera. It had recorded until the first light took the yard from black to blue. The last clip showed the dish slid farther right, and then jerked an inch all at once, like a stutter in the world. In the frame after that, the right-hand porch post was notched deeper. There was no animal, no person, just the work, patient, deliberate. The house changed its sounds over the next hours. Where it had creaked like an old body stretching, it now whispered. Not voices. Not anything I could write out in letters. More like fingers reminding one another how to count. When I went upstairs, the banister felt warm, as if a hand had not long ago been braced there. When I tried to nap, I woke to the soft scrape of something tetanus steel plate with a tongue of wood. I opened my eyes to a bright room and knew night would be worse than any that had come before. There is a point in fear where the body turns into a task list. Mine produced an idea that made me feel both practical and foolish. They were not chewing what they could not reach. If I could put stone between me and wood, if I could live ringed by concrete and iron, I might make a pocket of ordinary. I went to the basement, to the corner where cinder blocks slept in stacks beside old paint cans. The stairs above me thudded the way hearts do when you lay your head against your own chest and listen. I carried blocks to the bulkhead door and built a wall that would hold back wind at least, gravity at best. The blocks made a grateful sound when their weight settled. Sweat slicked my shoulders, dust clung to my lips. I set the last block and sat on the cool floor, and for the first time thought about my papers. Bank statements, birth certificate, the hardback books my mother had left me. Whole forests pressed into the size of a hand. It was a ridiculous thought, but it stayed. How many trees were in my life already, dressed in the clothing of civilization, waiting for the lesson the sycamore had learned to reach them. I went back up and gathered, part with, and what I could not, weighing the ridiculous against the necessary. Birth certificate in a plastic sleeve, one old photo album, a change of clothes, the laptop. The trail camera went in the bag. I left the books. It felt like betrayal. I told myself I would come back for them. I did not believe me. Around sunset, a knock tapped the front door. It was 3 even pulses delivered by knuckles that knew courtesy. I could not say why I knew it was a person and not a new trick of wood. But I did. When I cracked the door, the new steel plate carried the light without complaint and reflected the face of my next door neighbor, Jeff Crane. He held a casserole dish and wore the embarrassed look of a man whose wife has insisted he walk across the grass and check on the bachelor next door. Julie said, "We haven't seen you, and she made too much," he said. "Chicken and rice." "That's kind of you," I said. I was not sure yet what kind of lie would keep him safe. "You okay?" he said, peering past my shoulder. "Been a lot of banging over here today." "You building something?" "Replacing the door," I said. "The old one stuck when it rained." Jeff nodded. His gaze drifted toward the yard. The fence was behaving itself in the calm light. The sycamores beyond it wore their best posture. He shifted the dish between his hands, like a man thinking of a second errand. "You know they're calling for thunderstorms," he said. "Poles go down on our road when the wind picks up. If you lose power and want to throw your stuff in our freezer." The knock sounded again. 3 even pulses. Jeff looked at me as if to confirm it hadn't been him being odd. It came a 4th time. The steel did not move under it, but I felt the vibrations lick around the plate, through the wood like cold around a scarf. Jeff frowned and set the casserole on the porch table. He leaned, without thinking, to wrap the post in the old, friendly way of men who test paint with their knuckles. "You've got some critters chewing," he said, and drew his hand back with a hiss. A splinter slid into the pad of his index finger so cleanly. He did not notice until he saw the dot of bright blood. He shook his hand. The blood fell in a round drop onto the top step, and the step soaked it in as if it were rain. "Careful," I said. "The woods." I stopped. "What, hungry?" That word would trap him here harder than any lie could free him. "Old," I finished. Which was true in the same way an obituary says the deceased passed away. He laughed and sucked the finger and said, "Julie would be mad if he came back with nothing but a bandage to show for it." I promised I would return the dish. He stepped down one stair, and then paused and looked out toward the trees with a thoughtful squint and said, "Do you hear that?" I almost clapped my hands over his ears, like a parent shielding a child from a loud surprise. He tilted his head and then shook it. "Nothing," he said. "Eat was nothing. Let us know about the freezer." When he was gone, I took the casserole inside and placed it on the counter and stood beside it until my muscles let go enough for me to move. The food smelled warm. I could not make myself hungry. On the other side of the steel, wood traced my name in patience that had not had to learn itself. I spoke into the space between us, very quietly. "I will leave." The tracing paused. I had the ridiculous thought that I had hurt the house's feelings. I packed the truck at full dark. The garage door lifted with a groan that no longer sounded like honest labor. I eased the truck down the driveway and onto the road without headlights until the turn. When I let the beams flare, rabbits froze and fled, slate backs flashing white. The town fell away. Asphalt became the long, indifferent lane between fields where rows of corn had not yet closed the furrows and telephone poles made a perfect cadence into the night. I drove toward the interstate. When I passed under the first overpass, a pocket of cool air washed over the cab and made me feel briefly like I might be safe under concrete, as if stone made a weather of its own. I should have kept going until dawn. Instead, the river called me with the kind of rational reason that shapes the worst decisions a person will ever claim were inevitable. I told myself I would end it at the place it, because a circle is a kind of order. I took the exit for county roads, and then the smaller road into the hills, and then the dirt pull off, where my tire tracks from days ago were still shallow ghosts. I cut the engine and heard only the breath of water. The night made the sycamores into columns that, if you did not look too hard, did not lean at all. I took a flashlight and the hammer and the board studded with nails and stepped toward the bank. I did not get as far as before. The path had narrowed the way throats narrow when they swallow. Vines that had not been there days ago looped, low and taut. My light picked out a pale ellipse to my left, and I knew, without wanting the knowledge, that it was the peeled lip of the big sycamore beginning to open in welcome or mirth. I thought of salt. I thought of iron. I thought of all the stories that are less about rules for monsters than they are about the human need to believe rules exist. I set the nail bored down in the path, spikes up and stepped back. The mouth opened wider. Not a staged trick widen, not a neat hinge, but a slow give of layers. Sap flashed and then glowed as if it caught the moon and held it. My hand ached where fingers squeezed the hammer. I did not know what I meant to do with it. The tree bent a fraction toward the board, the way a person leans to see a new tool. Curiosity lover to intelligence. In the space of 3 blinks, the board was under the mouth. In the space of 1 more, the mouth was around the board. The hammer in my hand jerked as the board's far end was tugged, and I found myself yanked forward, like a man who has set a hook and forgotten which end of the line the fish is on. The nails sank into the flesh of the mouth, and there was no blood, only a shift in the sap's color, a darkening the way honey darkens when you hold it to a flame. The mouth did not withdraw. It pressed down. The wood around the nails buckled. When the mouth closed, the nails bent. When it opened, half the board was inside. "Take it," I said, over the grinding that lived where sound becomes sensation. Take it and not me. I am not proud of that bargain, because I do not know what I was offering. The mouth chewed. It took the board down in careful bites that did not hurry. Each time it closed, a notch vanished. Each time it opened, the gap where the board had been belonged to something older than arithmetic. In the pause between bites, the mouth lifted a little, as if listening to me. I do not know if trees understand plea, but they know posture. Mine was not a man ready to run. It was a man whose legs had decided they were roots. When the last of the board was gone, the mouth stayed open, expectant, on some mad impulse, perhaps, or surrender. I laid the hammer on the path and pushed it with my foot until the handle reached the mouth's shade. The mouth lowered. The head of the hammer clicked against what I know was not tooth, and I will call tooth anyway. The steel did not yield. The mouth closed again, firmer. A high keen rose that was almost not in my hearing, but in the nails of my fingers and the long bones of my forearms. I felt the handle go slack. The hammer slid away into the dark with the soft, appalling sound of wood joining wood. I left then, because there was nothing left to offer. That did not include parts of me I meant to keep. The path released me with that same impolite silence from the other nights. Back at the truck I drove to the interstate, and then past it, and then followed signs into the kind of commercial sprawl that grows wherever towns gather courage. Hotels with their polite signs, a gas station with bright islands of light, a parking lot wide as a small field. I pulled into the corner of a motel lot and parked under a lamp that hummed. The building was poured concrete dressed in stucco. The planters were plastic. It was as close to a world without wood as I could buy without an architect. Inside the room, every kindness someone had designed for a traveler looked like a trap. The bed had a headboard of foxwood laminate that did not comfort me at all. The desk had the exact grain pattern I had once admired in a catalog. The nightstand was a tree wearing makeup. I put the chair against the door out of habit, and then moved it because the chair was a thing that could learn. I sat on the floor with my back to the concrete wall and listened. The electricity sang. The air conditioner kicked on. Pipes ticked. And under all of it, faint enough that if you were not waiting for it, you could live a good life never hearing it. The kind of patient friction that had been practicing at my house continued its work somewhere in the building. An education shared without malice. Before dawn I walked outside. The parking lot carried the cool that only concrete can hold. A delivery truck idled near the entrance. On the landscaping strip between the curb and the sidewalk, one young ornamental maple had been staked upright with 2 wooden posts. One of the posts leaned a degree more than it had yesterday. The stake's twine sang a low warning note, and then went slack. The maple did nothing more than be a maple. I stood with my keys in my hand, and the certainty came not like thunder, but like a ledger closing. There is no version of the world where the lesson unlearns itself. What opens will continue to open. What chews will continue to chew. Movement between frames is still movement, and insistence is a kind of nutrition. I drove to a storage facility that advertised climate control and asked for a unit with cinder block walls. The manager, a woman with a pen tucked behind her ear, like a soldier's cigarette, did not comment on my requirement. She handed me a contract printed on paper slick as skin. My pen wrote my name without me, and the loop in the H looked like a mouth. I used the unit as a room. I slept there on an aluminum cot, and the first night in that box, I did not hear the door learn my name. But I did hear the edges of silence working at something I could not see. The next morning, I brought the photo album and the birth certificate and left the books on my kitchen table, where the morning light sang their spines into the day. I locked the steel plate behind me. As I walked to the truck, I did not look at the trees. I am writing this because proof has to start somewhere. I know how it sounds. I know you can say sycamores exfoliate their bark, and that wildlife worries at it, and that houses shrink and swell when humidity changes, and that cameras glitch, and that fear retrieves patterns the world did not put down. You can be right about every one of those things and still be wrong about what happens in the space between the ticks of a second hand. I have started to notice small changes in places where wood is not supposed to carry on, fences with old scars that look new, picnic tables whose grain makes words when the light is right. I am careful not to lean against anything but concrete. I sleep with my head away from the headboard. I keep my reading to screens and pray that the glass does not learn the trick of the trees. I pass the river sometimes because you cannot not pass the river if you live here. When I glance over, the big sycamore looks like any other pillar in a cathedral of trunks. I do not see its mouth. I do not need to see it. Between frames, between breaths, across thresholds that only patience recognizes, things are learning. I can hear the lesson at the edge of hearing if I do not fill my head with radio or conversation. It is not a threat any more than the tide is a threat. It is an appetite given an alphabet. It is a smile learning to say the names it has been fed. When the evening is still enough, and I am alone enough to tell the truth, I know the door back home will finish the last consonant of my name, and when it does, the house will mean me. I do not know what the world will be in the frame after that. I only know I will feel the answer first in my teeth.